Hi Angels! This will be the Green Pup in a Den of Heroes by the Angel Demon on AO3. Here is the summary. The Green Pup in a Den of Heroes follows Izuku Midoriya, who is adopted by pro-heroes Aizawa and Hizashi. As Izuku trains at UA High and learns to control his quirk, one for all, he grapples with self-doubt, the pressure to become a hero, and his complex relationship with Bakugo. Through the UA Sports Festival, Izuku faces physical and emotional challenges, helping Todoroki embrace his power. Although Izuku doesn't win, he realizes that heroism is about growth and making a difference, not just victories. In the end, Izuku finds family, belonging, and the strength to move forward.
Chapter 1, Stray Pup. Summary. After rescuing Izuku from a bullying incident, Aizawa Shota, a typically stoic and distant pro-hero, can't ignore the signs of neglect and emotional abuse that the young boy endures at home. Aizawa, already living with his longtime partner, Hizashi Yamada, present Mike, discusses the idea of adopting the boy. Hizashi's warm and supportive personality contrasts with Aizawa's tough exterior, making them a balanced couple that offers Izuku both comfort and discipline. Story. Aizawa Shota wasn't one to dwell on emotions, especially not when it came to strangers. His world was filled with larger concerns, villains, crime, keeping his students safe. But that didn't mean he was blind to the suffering around him. And today, on what should have been an ordinary patrol through Mizutafu, something tugged at him, urging him to stop and pay attention. It started as a muffled sound. Quiet. Easy to miss, especially for someone like Aizawa, who often drowned out the noise of the city during his patrols. But he heard it. A faint sob, followed by the echo of hurried footsteps retreating into the distance. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the area, trying to place the source. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows over the alleyways, giving them a foreboding air. That's when he saw it, a small figure huddled in the dim recess of an alley. A kid. Aizawa wasn't the type to stop for every child playing hide-and-seek or sneaking away from chores, but something about the way this boy was hunched over, shoulders shaking, made him pause. There was no joy or mischief in this scene. This was something else. He stepped closer, his boots barely making a sound on the pavement. As he approached, he could see the boy more clearly now. A head of messy green curls, a dirted school uniform, and arms wrapped tightly around a notebook, as if the paper within it held the only comfort in the world. Aizawa's eyes softened, his heart constricting just a little. He'd seen this before, the quiet defeat, the way the boy tried to shrink into himself, like he could disappear if he just wished hard enough. "Oi, kid," Aizawa called out, his voice low, but firm. He didn't want to startle him. The boy's head snapped up, and for a brief moment, Aizawa saw raw fear in those wide, tear-filled green eyes. The boy pressed himself further against the cold brick wall, his grip on the notebook tightening to the point where his knuckles turned white. I am sorry," the boy stammered, his voice trembling with panic. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. Please, please don't." Aizawa crouched down, keeping his distance but ensuring he was on the boy's level. His gaze softened further. "I'm not here to punish you. Just wanted to see if you're okay." The boy blinked at him, confused. He wasn't used to someone asking if he was okay. Not really. Slowly, the tension in his body eased, but he didn't let go of the notebook. "Why would you care?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as though the question itself pained him. Aizawa frowned. He wasn't one to coddle kids, but the despair in the boy's voice was like a punch to the gut. He'd seen it before in his students, the ones who had been let down by the world too many times. But this boy, he was too young to be carrying such heavy pain. "What's your name?" Aizawa asked, deciding to move past the boy's question for now. The boy hesitated, eyes flickering to the ground again. "Midoriya." Midoriya Izuku. Aizawa nodded, the name stirring something in his memory. He'd heard it before, but it was hazy, the kind of name that stuck out because of how often it had been dismissed. A quirkless boy, the one who wanted to be a hero despite everything. He should have guessed. Before Aizawa could ask another question, a familiar voice echoed down the alley. Shota. Man, you're supposed to meet me at the present mic, or Yamada Hizashi as Aizawa knew him, came to a halt when he noticed the scene before him. His usual boisterous energy dimmed instantly as he took in the sight of the small, trembling boy. Hizashi approached cautiously, his ever-present grin replaced by a more subdued expression of concern. Hey there, little listener, he said, crouching beside Aizawa. His voice was warm, kind, a stark contrast to the sharpness Aizawa often displayed. You all right? Izuku flinched, shrinking further into himself, as if expecting a barrage of questions or a scolding. But when nothing harsh came, he dared a small glance up at the man with the bright blonde hair and sunglasses perched on his head. There was no judgment in his eyes. Only concern. Genuine concern. He doesn't look all right, Hizashi whispered to Aizawa, but loud enough for the boy to hear. Aizawa grunted in agreement, his focus still on Izuku. Found him here. Looks like he's been in a fight. His voice was calm, but beneath it was a current of anger, directed at whoever had dared hurt this kid. Izuku shook his head rapidly, his voice cracking as he tried to explain, it wasn't a fight. I don't have a quirk. I can't fight. The words were laced with shame, and Aizawa could see the way Izuku's shoulders slumped as if even speaking about his lack of a quirk was a wound that refused to heal. The boy had been carrying this burden alone for far too long, and it showed in every movement, every glance, every breath. Aizawa's jaw clenched. This was more than just a rough day. He could see it now, the bruises, not just on his skin, but in his spirit. How long has this been going on? Hizashi asked gently, his eyes wide with empathy. Izuku didn't answer. His lips pressed together, and he looked away, his body still tense, as if bracing for something, rejection, dismissal, perhaps the same cold indifference he'd faced countless times before. Aizawa's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd seen enough. This kid wasn't just another case of schoolyard bullying, this was something much worse. The weight on Izuku's shoulders was more than he should ever have to bear, and it didn't seem like anyone had cared enough to help him before now. He stood up, casting a quick glance at Hizashi, who nodded in silent agreement. The decision was made before Aizawa even voiced it. Come on, Aizawa said, extending a hand to Izuku. You're coming with us. Izuku stared at the hand in front of him like it was something foreign, something too good to be real. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to decline, to say he was fine, to apologize for being a burden. That's what he'd always been told, that he was too much trouble, that his dreams were impossible, that he didn't belong. What? Izuku stuttered, pulling his notebook closer to his chest. Why? I'm fine, really. I don't want to be any trouble. Hizashi let out a soft chuckle, but there was no amusement in his voice, only sadness for the boy who clearly didn't believe he deserved help. Kid, you're not trouble. Trust me. We just don't think you should be alone right now. Aizawa nodded, his expression unreadable, but his voice softened. It's not safe for you to go home like this. Izuku's lips parted, another protest forming on his tongue, but he hesitated. The exhaustion, the physical and emotional toll of everything, was catching up to him. His body ached, his mind was heavy, and the thought of going back to an empty, cold apartment where no one would even ask how he was, it was unbearable. Slowly, cautiously, Izuku reached out and took Aizawa's hand. The moment their hands touched, something shifted in the air. It wasn't much, just a flicker of warmth, of something unfamiliar blooming in Izuku's chest. A quiet hope, small and fragile, but there nonetheless. Hizashi stood up, smiling softly as he led the way out of the alley, chatting about random things in an effort to keep the atmosphere light. He talked about his latest radio show, his recent patrols, and even threw in some playful jokes to try and coax a smile from the boy. Aizawa stayed silent, his hand firm but gentle as he guided Izuku alongside him, ensuring he wouldn't falter. As they walked together, Izuku couldn't help but steal glances at the two pro-heroes who had so effortlessly stepped into his life. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if this kindness would last, if this warmth was something he could trust, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 2, A New Family. Summary. Izuku is officially adopted by the couple, but adjusting to life in their household isn't easy. Hizashi is openly affectionate and tries to make Izuku feel comfortable with music, laughter, and a sense of belonging, while Aizawa is stricter but clearly protective. Izuku slowly begins to trust his new dads, finding moments of peace and love, though he's still haunted by his past. The walk back to Aizawa and Hizashi's apartment was silent, but not in a way that made Izuku feel uncomfortable. It was more like the world had shifted into a slow, steady rhythm, the occasional hum of passing cars and the soft murmur of Hizashi's voice filling the quiet with a sense of calm. Izuku didn't know what to make of the situation. His mind was spinning with questions, all of them buzzing in his head like a hive of restless bees. Why had these two pro-heroes decided to help him? Why had they even noticed him in the first place? What did they want from him? He hadn't had someone show this much kindness in, well, longer than he could remember. Even his mother, kind as she was, didn't have the time or energy to help him with the weight he carried. She worked late, trying to keep them afloat. The space in between them had grown over the years, and Izuku had stopped asking for comfort long ago. When they finally arrived at the building, Hizashi led the way up the stairs, his voice a steady stream of chatter as he unlocked the door. "Welcome to Casa Eraser Mike," he announced cheerfully, pushing the door open. "Well, that's not official or anything, but you get the idea." Izuku blinked, surprised at how warm and normal the apartment felt. It was modest in size, nothing extravagant, but clean, cozy, and filled with personal touches that told a story of its inhabitants. A few framed pictures lined the walls, photos of Aizawa and Hizashi in their UA days, smiling with their classmates and fellow heroes. There was even a picture of Aizawa with a stray cat curled up in his arms, looking slightly annoyed but not enough to stop it from happening. The place smelled faintly of coffee and a hint of something herbal, like tea. It wasn't the sterile environment of a professional hero's house that Izuku had imagined. It was just, homey. "Make yourself at home," Hizashi said, tossing his coat over the back of a chair and disappearing into what Izuku assumed was the kitchen. "Shota, why don't you grab some extra clothes for the kid? Looks like he could use a shower too." Izuku opened his mouth to protest, to say that he didn't want to be a burden, but the look Aizawa shut him down immediately. Aizawa didn't say anything, but his dark eyes held a message that Izuku couldn't quite decipher. Something like, "You're not a burden. Stop thinking like that." Aizawa's apartment was simple, no extravagant decor or unnecessary clutter. It was practical, much like the man himself. Izuku found comfort in the simplicity, in the way everything seemed to have its place, unlike the chaotic mess of emotions he usually carried. Aizawa disappeared down a hallway for a moment, returning with a stack of neatly folded clothes, an old UA t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants that were clearly too big for Izuku, but the best they had. "Bathrooms down the hall to the right," Aizawa said quietly, handing the clothes to Izuku. "Take your time." Izuku hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he took the clothes. He was used to going unnoticed, to slipping through the cracks of other people's lives. But now, standing in the warm glow of this apartment, with these two pro-heroes watching over him, it was as if he didn't know how to handle being seen. Thank you, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Aizawa gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable, but there was a softness in his gaze that made Izuku feel something stir deep in his chest. He turned and made his way to the bathroom, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He stood there for a moment, just staring at himself in the mirror. His reflection stared back, eyes rimmed with red from crying, dirt smudged across his cheeks. He looked tired. Weary in a way no child should look. Izuku let out a shaky breath, quickly stripping off his dirty uniform and stepping into the shower. The water was warm, washing away the grime and the lingering weight of the day. He stood under the stream for what felt like an eternity, his body relaxing for the first time in hours, maybe days. But no amount of warm water could wash away the deeper ache, the one that had been growing inside him for years. The feeling of being less than, of being invisible, of being quirkless in a world where power meant everything. The water ran down his face, mingling with the silent tears that fell from his eyes. When he finally stepped out of the shower, he felt a little lighter, but the hollow pit in his chest remained. He dried himself off quickly, slipping into the oversized t-shirt and sweatpants. They hung loosely on his small frame, but the soft fabric was a comfort he didn't realize he needed. Izuku took a deep breath and left the bathroom, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped back into the living room. Hizashi was sitting on the couch, legs crossed as he hummed to himself, scrolling through something on his phone. When he saw Izuku, he grinned and gave a thumbs up. Looking good, little listener. Feel better? Izuku nodded shyly, unsure how to respond to the warmth radiating from this man. Hizashi's energy was contagious, in a way that didn't overwhelm Izuku like most loud voices did. It was comforting, like a blanket of sound that wrapped around him. Aizawa emerged from the kitchen with a steaming mug in his hand, his eyes drifting over to Izuku. He didn't say anything at first, just studied the boy with a quiet intensity, as if assessing the damage that couldn't be seen on the surface. "You're staying here tonight," Aizawa said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Izuku's mouth opened to protest, but Hizashi was already patting the cushion next to him on the couch, motioning for him to sit. Yeah, don't worry about it. You can take the spare room, Shoto'll be more than happy to sleep on the couch." He winked at Aizawa, whose eyes narrowed, but there was no real heat behind his gaze. Izuku hesitated before shuffling over to the couch, perching awkwardly on the edge of the seat. He felt out of place here, like he didn't belong in this warm, welcoming space. But the weight of exhaustion was pulling at him, and he didn't have the energy to fight it anymore. Aizawa sat in the armchair across from him, sipping his tea in silence. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was steady, like the calm before a storm. Hizashi, meanwhile, kept the conversation going, asking Izuku light-hearted questions about his interests, his favorite heroes, and even cracking a few jokes about Aizawa's perpetual grumpiness. Izuku answered as best he could, his voice soft and unsure, but slowly, as the minutes ticked by, he found himself relaxing. The ache in his chest didn't feel as unbearable here, with these two pro-heroes who seemed to genuinely care. It was strange. The loneliness he had grown so accustomed to, the feeling of being unwanted, was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But for the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't crushing him. When Hizashi disappeared into the kitchen to grab some snacks, Aizawa finally spoke again, his voice low and serious. "Midoriya." Izuku stiffened, turning to face him. There was something about the way Aizawa said his name, like he wasn't just another kid, like he mattered. "You're safe here," Aizawa said, his eyes boring into Izuku's. "But I need to know the truth." What happened today? What's been happening? Izuku's heart raced, his palms beginning to sweat. He wanted to shrink back, to disappear into the cushions of the couch and never have to answer that question. But there was something in Aizawa's gaze, something firm but kind, that made Izuku stop running from the truth. I got caught by Kaken again, Izuku whispered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. He always. Aizawa's jaw tightened at the mention of the name, and even without Izuku finishing the sentence, he understood. This wasn't a one-time incident. This was something that had been going on for far too long, unchecked, unnoticed by anyone who should have intervened. Why didn't you tell anyone? Aizawa's voice was quiet, but there was an undercurrent of frustration, though Izuku could tell it wasn't directed at him. I didn't want to bother anyone, Izuku said, his voice trembling. I'm quirkless. No one cares about someone like me. The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, there was only silence. Izuku's chest felt tight, like he had just confessed something terrible, something unforgivable. But Aizawa's next words caught him off guard. That's bullshit, he said bluntly, his eyes hard. Your worth isn't determined by whether or not you have a quirk. Izuku blinked, staring at him in shock. No one had ever said that to him. No one had ever told him that his value wasn't tied to his abilities, that he could matter even without a quirk. Hizashi reappeared from the kitchen, holding a bowl of popcorn and grinning ear to ear. All right, let's lighten the mood, he said, plopping down next to Izuku and ruffling his hair. You're one of us now, kid. No more talking about not being worth it, okay? Izuku didn't know what to say. His chest ached, but this time it was different. The ache wasn't from pain or fear, it was from the overwhelming realization that maybe, just maybe, these two heroes cared. Maybe, for the first time in his life, he wasn't completely alone. Chapter 3, Finding Balance. Summary. Life with two pro-heroes as parents is challenging. Izuku has to navigate Aizawa's harsh discipline and practical nature while embracing Hizashi's exuberance. He begins to see how their contrasting personalities work in harmony, creating a loving environment that's entirely new to him. But Izuku still feels incomplete without a quirk. Izuku had never known silence could be so heavy. The apartment was quiet now, save for the occasional soft clink of a teacup or the rustling of Hizashi flipping through a magazine, his usual boisterous energy contained in a rare moment of calm. But in that calm, Izuku found himself overwhelmed by the unfamiliar warmth that had settled in his chest, an ache that wasn't painful, but confusing. It wasn't the loneliness he'd been used to, this was something different. He glanced over at Aizawa, who sat across from him in the armchair, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window. It was impossible to tell what the man was thinking. His face was as impassive as ever, the dark bags under his eyes giving him a perpetually tired look. But there was something about Aizawa's stillness that made Izuku feel oddly safe. The man didn't fidget or fuss. He simply was. Solid. Unyielding. It made Izuku feel like the floor wouldn't fall out from under him so long as Aizawa was there. Hizashi, in contrast, radiated an energy that buzzed even when he was quiet. He sat beside Izuku on the couch, tapping his fingers lightly on his thigh as he flipped through pages, occasionally shooting the boy a bright grin, like it was his mission to make Izuku smile just once tonight. The house was full of unspoken emotions, but none of them felt dangerous or oppressive. Still, despite the warmth and the comfort, Izuku's mind refused to settle. He was sitting in the living room of two of the most well-known pro-heroes in the country, two men who had somehow decided he was worth saving. His thoughts spiraled endlessly around that fact, making his stomach twist with both anxiety and something he was too afraid to call hope. He didn't want to hope. Hope had failed him too many times. Hizashi broke the silence first, stretching his arms above his head and letting out a loud yawn. Man, this is a quiet night. Usually, Shota's on the couch grading papers, and I'm blasting music in my headphones. Aizawa gave him a sidelong glance, unimpressed. You're not blasting anything at this hour. Hizashi winked at Izuku as if to say, see. This is what I deal with, but the grin softened when he caught the look of uncertainty on the boy's face. Izuku was sitting at the edge of the couch, his back ramrod straight, like he was waiting for permission to leave or maybe bracing for an inevitable fallout. His hands were resting in his lap, tightly clasped together, and his legs barely reached the edge of the couch cushions. He looked so small, so fragile. Hey, Hizashi said gently, nudging the boy's shoulder. What's going on in that head of yours? Izuku flinched, startled out of his thoughts. He blinked up at Hizashi, trying to find the right words. What was going on in his head? A whirlwind. 1,000 different things, all jumbled together, none of them making sense. He wanted to say something, anything, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. I don't, his words faltered, his hands tightening their grip on each other. I'm sorry. Hizashi frowned, the smile slipping from his face. Sorry. For what? For being here. For bothering you. Izuku's voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of the words was heavy, as if he had been carrying them for years. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Aizawa sighed softly, putting his cup of tea down on the small table beside him. You're not causing trouble, Midoriya. We wouldn't have brought you here if we didn't want you to be here. Izuku's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly ducked his head, unable to hold Aizawa's gaze. He wasn't used to this. People didn't say things like that to him. Even his mother, as much as she loved him, had never told him so directly that he wasn't a burden. He had always felt like one. Like an anchor, weighing everyone around him down. Hizashi leaned back against the couch, stretching his legs out in front of him. Shota's right, kid. You're not bothering anyone. You're part of the team now. Izuku blinked at him, confusion clear on his face. Part of the team. Hizashi chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair with a playful hand. Yep. Team Eraser Mike. Well, unofficially, but hey, we're cool with expanding the team a little. Aizawa rolled his eyes but didn't protest. What Hizashi is trying to say is, you're safe here. You're welcome here. Izuku stared at them, his chest tightening. He didn't understand why they were being so kind to him. He didn't deserve it. He was quirkless. He wasn't special. Why would two pro-heroes take in someone like him? His hands clenched tightly in his lap again, his voice small and shaky. But, why? Why me? Aizawa's eyes flickered with something unreadable as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Because no one else did. And because you deserve better than what you've been given. The words hit Izuku like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath out of him. His throat tightened, and he could feel the sting of tears burning behind his eyes. No one had ever said something like that to him before. No one had ever told him he deserved better. For so long, he had believed that this was just the way things were supposed to be. That he was supposed to be invisible, forgotten, left behind because he didn't have a quirk. That his dreams of becoming a hero were nothing but foolish fantasies. But now there were these two men, heroes he admired, telling him that he deserved more. That he was worth something. It was overwhelming. Too much. He didn't know how to process it. Izuku's voice cracked, and he quickly bit down on his lip, trying to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. He didn't want to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. He was already weak enough. He didn't want to be even more pathetic. But Hizashi noticed immediately, his sharp eyes catching the way Izuku's shoulders were trembling, the way his hands were gripping each other so tightly it looked like it hurt. Without a word, he scooted closer to the boy, his arm wrapping around Izuku's shoulders in a gentle, comforting gesture. "It's okay, kid," Hizashi said softly, his voice soothing. "You don't have to hold it in. You're safe here." That was it. The dam broke. The tears spilled over, and Izuku couldn't stop them. He buried his face in his hands, his small frame shaking with silent sobs. He had tried so hard to be strong, to keep everything inside, but now it was all crashing down on him. The pain, the loneliness, the fear, it all came pouring out in uncontrollable waves. Aizawa remained quiet, watching as the boy finally let go of the emotions he had been bottling up for so long. He didn't move to comfort him physically, he wasn't the type to offer that kind of affection, but there was a deep understanding in his eyes. He knew what it was like to carry too much weight, to feel like the world had given up on you. Hizashi, on the other hand, kept his arm around Izuku, murmuring soft words of reassurance as the boy cried. He didn't try to stop the tears or tell Izuku to calm down. He just let him feel it, let him get it all out, because he knew that was what Izuku needed most right now. After what felt like an eternity, the sobs began to quiet, and Izuku's breathing slowly evened out. He wiped at his eyes with the sleeve of his too large shirt, his face flushed with embarrassment. He felt so exposed, so vulnerable. He didn't want to look at either of them, too ashamed of his outburst. But Hizashi was still smiling gently at him, no judgment in his eyes, only warmth. "Feeling a little better?" Izuku nodded hesitantly, his voice hoarse from crying. Sorry." "None of that," Hizashi said, ruffling his hair again. "No more apologies, okay? You're allowed to feel things. We've got your back, little listener." Aizawa nodded in agreement, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't need to apologize for being human, Midoriya." Izuku sniffled, his heart still heavy, but the ache wasn't as unbearable as before. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Maybe he wasn't completely alone after all. Later that night, after Hizashi had made sure Izuku had eaten something, despite the boy's insistence that he wasn't hungry, and Aizawa had set up the spare room with a futon and extra blankets, the apartment finally settled into a quiet lull. Izuku sat on the edge of the futon, staring at the wall. He was exhausted, physically, emotionally, mentally. His body ached from the tension he had been holding all day, and his eyes were sore from crying. But even now, as he sat in the comfort of a warm, safe home, sleep felt like a distant dream. The events of the day played on a loop in his mind, his thoughts spinning out of control. He couldn't stop thinking about Kaken, about the way his face had twisted into that familiar sneer, his hands crackling with the heat of his explosions as he taunted Izuku for being weak, for being worthless. And then there was Aizawa and Hizashi. Two heroes he had admired from afar, two people he never thought would even notice him, let alone take him in. He didn't understand why they had helped him. Why they cared. What if it was only temporary? What if this kindness was just a fleeting moment, and tomorrow they would change their minds, realize he wasn't worth the trouble, and send him away? The thought made his chest tighten with fear, his breath hitching in his throat. He didn't want to be sent away. He didn't want to go back to the life he had before, where every day was a struggle just to get through without being noticed. But he was too scared to believe that this was real. Too scared to hope. The door to the spare room creaked open, and Izuku jumped, quickly wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. Aizawa stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes watching the boy carefully. "You should be sleeping," Aizawa said, his voice low but not unkind. Izuku bit his lip, looking down at his hands. I can't. Aizawa stepped into the room, his gaze flickering to the futon before settling back on the boy. Too much going on in your head. Izuku nodded silently, his fingers twisting in the fabric of the blanket. He felt so small, so vulnerable. He hated that he couldn't just be strong, couldn't just handle things like everyone else. But Aizawa didn't push him. Instead, he sat down at the edge of the futon, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. It's normal to feel like that after what you've been through. It's not going to go away overnight. Izuku blinked up at him, surprised by the gentle understanding in the man's voice. Aizawa wasn't being harsh or impatient, he was just being there. Steady. I know it's hard to believe, but you're safe here, Aizawa continued, his voice softer now. You don't have to keep running from everything. Izuku swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know if he even had the words to express what he was feeling. But Aizawa didn't seem to need a response. He just sat there, his presence alone enough to ease the tension in the room. You should try to sleep, Aizawa said after a moment, standing up and heading for the door. Hizashi and I will be right outside if you need anything. Izuku nodded again, watching as Aizawa left the room, the door closing softly behind him. The room was quiet again, but the silence wasn't as heavy as before. It felt lighter. Warmer. For the first time in what felt like forever, Izuku allowed himself to believe, just a little bit, that maybe things could be different. Maybe, just maybe, he could be part of a family.
Chapter 4, All Might's Offer. Summary. Izuku's world is turned upside down when All Might offers him one for all. Aizawa is initially against the idea of Izuku becoming a hero, fearing for his safety. Hizashi, however, argues that it's their job to support Izuku's dreams, not hold him back. This chapter explores their dynamic as a couple, with Aizawa's protective instincts clashing with Hizashi's optimism. Story. The weeks following Izuku's arrival in Aizawa and Hizashi's home were both strange and comforting for him. Every morning, he woke up in the spare room that had become his own, still half expecting to be told that he had to leave, that this was all temporary. But each day that passed without that happening allowed a tiny glimmer of hope to grow inside him, a hope that maybe, just maybe, this was real. Aizawa's house wasn't like anything Izuku had expected a pro-hero's home to be. It was quiet, steady, and practical, much like Aizawa himself. Mornings were simple. Aizawa always woke up early to make toast and coffee, while Hizashi filled the air with cheerful humming or music playing softly from the kitchen speakers. It felt like a routine, something Izuku had never experienced with such consistency before. It was normal. Izuku had never known what it was like to live with heroes, let alone two of them. He had expected a constant flurry of hero work, battles, and meetings, but instead, the apartment was filled with small, domestic moments. Aizawa, sipping his coffee while checking reports, or Hizashi, sprawled out on the couch, recounting his latest radio show with dramatic flair. Izuku found himself quietly drawn into their lives, learning to navigate the rhythm of their home. He still had moments of doubt, moments where the small voice inside his head told him that this was all temporary, that eventually, they would realize he wasn't worth the trouble. But those moments were growing fewer. Each time Hizashi smiled at him over dinner, or Aizawa ruffled his hair on his way out the door, something in Izuku's chest loosened, just a little bit. But despite the growing comfort of his new life, a deep ache still lingered inside him, a sense of incompleteness, the nagging feeling of not being enough. No matter how much Aizawa and Hizashi tried to make him feel welcome, he couldn't shake the knowledge that he was still quirkless in a world that revered power above all else. It was this thought that weighed heavily on Izuku's mind one particular afternoon as he walked through the familiar streets of Muzitafu. He had spent the morning helping Hizashi with some household tasks, but now that Aizawa was out on patrol, Hizashi had nudged Izuku outside, insisting he get some fresh air. The air was crisp, with the scent of autumn leaves clinging to the wind as it rustled through the trees. Izuku kept his hands in his pockets, his head down, lost in thought as he wandered aimlessly. No matter how much he tried to push the feelings away, the emptiness gnawed at him. He wanted so badly to be like them, to be a hero, to have a quirk, to be worth something. He didn't even notice the tall figure approaching him until a familiar deep voice rang out. Midoriya Shonen. Izuku's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief as he came face to face with the #1 hero himself, All Might. All Might? Izuku stammered, his heart skipping a beat. The towering hero stood before him in his regular form, his thin frame and sunken cheeks a stark contrast to the image of the invincible hero that the world knew. Yet, even in his weakened state, All Might's presence was overwhelming. Izuku's hand shook slightly as he bowed deeply, his voice trembling with awe. I didn't expect to see you here, sir. What are you doing here? All Might smiled warmly, though there was a seriousness in his gaze that Izuku couldn't quite place. I was actually looking for you, young Midoriya. Izuku blinked in confusion. For me? Why? All Might's expression softened. I've been watching you, young man. You have a heart full of courage and a spirit that refuses to give up, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It's rare to find that kind of determination in someone who has been dealt such a difficult hand. Izuku felt his face flush with both embarrassment and disbelief. But I'm quirkless. I can't. All Might held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Being a hero is about much more than just having a powerful quirk. It's about what's in here. He tapped his chest lightly, just above his heart. And you, young Midoriya, have the heart of a true hero. Izuku's breath caught in his throat, his mind spinning. This couldn't be real. All Might, was saying that he believed in him? That he saw something in him? It didn't make sense. He was just a quirkless kid. He wasn't. But I didn't come here just to offer kind words, All Might continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. I've been searching for someone to inherit my power, and I believe you are the one. Izuku froze, his eyes widening in shock. I inherit your power? What do you mean? All Might straightened his posture, his thin frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. My quirk, one for all, is a power that can be passed down from one person to another. It was given to me by my predecessor, and now, it's my turn to pass it on to someone who embodies the true spirit of heroism. That someone, Midoriya Shonen, is you. Izuku's mind reeled, his thoughts spinning out of control. One for all? A quirk that could be passed down? And All Might was offering it to him? But, why me? Izuku whispered, his voice trembling. I'm nobody. All Might's gaze softened. You're not nobody, young man. You've shown more bravery and selflessness than many pro-heroes I've known. Even without a quirk, you've stood up to those far more powerful than you because you believe in doing what's right. That is the mark of a true hero. And with my power, you can become the hero you've always dreamed of being. Izuku's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. This was everything he had ever wanted, everything he had ever dreamed of. But it felt too unreal, too impossible. He wasn't worthy of something like this. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't. I don't know if I can, Izuku whispered, his hands trembling. I don't know if I'm strong enough to handle something like that. All Might smiled gently, placing a hand on Izuku's shoulder. Strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about facing your fears and moving forward anyway. And I believe you have that strength inside you, Midoriya Shonen. Izuku swallowed hard, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He had spent his entire life feeling like he wasn't enough, like he would never be enough. But now, standing in front of the greatest hero of all time, being offered a chance to become the very thing he had always dreamed of, something inside him shifted. I want to try, Izuku said softly, his voice trembling but filled with a new determination. I want to be a hero. All Might's smile widened, and he gave Izuku's shoulder a firm squeeze. That's the spirit, young man. We'll begin your training right away. This won't be easy, but if anyone can do it, I know it's you. Izuku's heart soared, his mind racing with excitement and fear all at once. This was the beginning of something new, something that could change everything. As All Might explained the basics of One for All and the training regimen Izuku would need to undertake, the young boy listened intently, hanging on every word. But as the conversation went on, a small flicker of doubt crept into Izuku's mind. What would Aizawa and Hizashi think? Would they support this decision, or would they try to stop him? He couldn't bear the thought of disappointing them, especially after everything they had done for him. All Might, Izuku said hesitantly, his voice quiet. There's something I need to tell you. All Might raised an eyebrow, curious. What is it, young man? Izuku took a deep breath, steeling himself. I've been living with two pro-heroes, Aizawa-sensei and Present Mike. They took me in after everything with Kaken, and I don't know how they'll feel about me becoming a hero. I don't want to disappoint them. All Might's expression softened with understanding. Aizawa and Yamada are both wise heroes. I'm sure they want what's best for you. But this is your journey, Midoriya Shonen. You have to choose the path that feels right for you. Izuku nodded, but the knot in his stomach remained. He couldn't shake the fear that Aizawa, with his strict and pragmatic approach to heroism, might think he was making a reckless decision. And what if Hizashi, with his infectious optimism, expected too much of him? I'll talk to them, Izuku said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. I'll tell them everything. All Might smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Izuku's shoulder once more. I'm sure they'll understand. And remember, young Midoriya, you're not alone in this. I'll be here to guide you every step of the way. Izuku nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. This was the opportunity he had always dreamed of, but it also felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He had to prove that he was worthy of this power, not just to All Might, but to himself. As they parted ways, Izuku's thoughts raced ahead of him. He had no idea how Aizawa and Hizashi would react to the news. But one thing was certain, his life was about to change forever. Chapter 5, Training and Trust. Summary. As Izuku begins his quirk training, Aizawa and Hizashi work together to support him in their own ways. Aizawa teaches him discipline and control, ensuring that Izuku understands the responsibility of power, while Hizashi keeps his spirits high, always reminding him that he's not alone. Their different approaches sometimes lead to disagreements, but they always come together, united in their love for Izuku. Story. Izuku's heart felt like it was trying to escape his chest as he walked home after meeting with All Might. The number one hero had just offered him something beyond his wildest dreams, a chance to inherit One for All, the power that had made All Might the symbol of peace. And yet, the excitement buzzing in his veins was tainted by a growing pit of anxiety. How would Aizawa and Hizashi react to this? In his time living with them, Izuku had begun to understand the delicate balance of their personalities. Hizashi was easygoing, full of energy and encouragement, always looking for the bright side of things. Aizawa, on the other hand, was stricter, practical to the point of seeming cold at times, but Izuku knew that he cared deeply, even if he didn't show it as easily as Hizashi did. And yet, despite their differences, they both shared the same protective instincts. They had taken him in when no one else had, showing him a kindness that he hadn't known before. But this? Inheriting All Might's quirk? Izuku had no idea how they'd feel about it. He was scared that Aizawa might think he was rushing into something dangerous. Maybe he'd think Izuku wasn't ready, that he wasn't enough to handle such a powerful ability. And Hizashi? Hizashi would likely be supportive, but would his usual optimism blind him to how terrifying this responsibility really was? Izuku swallowed hard as he approached the apartment building, his feet dragging on the pavement. He knew he had to tell them. Keeping something this big from them wasn't an option, not after everything they had done for him. When he finally stepped through the door, the warmth of the apartment hit him like a soft blanket. The familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of Hizashi's voice floating from the kitchen greeted him, making him feel a little less like his world was about to unravel. "Yo! Zuku, that you?" Hizashi called, sticking his head out from the kitchen with a wide grin. He waved Izuku over energetically. "Come here, we're just about to eat." Izuku smiled weakly and shuffled into the kitchen. Aizawa was sitting at the small dining table, eyes half-lidded, the ever-present tiredness etched on his face. Hizashi was bustling around with bowls of ramen, his apron tied loosely around his waist as he hummed a tune to himself. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that for a brief moment, Izuku almost forgot about the weight of the secret he was carrying. Almost. As they sat down to eat, Hizashi prattled on about his latest radio show, while Aizawa listened quietly, occasionally interjecting with a grunt or a short comment. Izuku tried to focus on his food, but the noodles felt heavy in his mouth, like each bite was dragging him further down into the pit of anxiety that had taken residence in his stomach. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore. I have to tell you something," Izuku blurted out, his voice shaking slightly. Both Hizashi and Aizawa turned to look at him, Hizashi's eyebrows raised in curiosity, while Aizawa's expression remained impassive. "What's up, little listener?" Hizashi asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. Izuku swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He didn't know where to start. The words felt too big, too monumental for him to even comprehend fully, let alone explain to them. I met All Might today," Izuku began, his voice barely above a whisper. Aizawa's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't speak. Hizashi's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Whoa! All Might? You mean the All Might? That's incredible. What happened? Did he give you advice or something?" Izuku took a deep breath, his heart hammering in his chest. "No, he offered me his quirk." The silence that followed was deafening. Aizawa's eyes widened slightly, the only sign that he was taken off guard, while Hizashi blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "Wait, what?" Hizashi finally said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You mean, like, he offered to give you his quirk? How does that even?" "It's called One for All," Izuku interrupted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "It's a quirk that can be passed down from one person to another. All Might inherited it from someone before him, and now, he wants to give it to me." Hizashi sat back in his chair, clearly trying to process the information, while Aizawa's expression shifted into something unreadable. I know it sounds crazy," Izuku continued, his voice trembling. "But he said he thinks I have the heart of a true hero. That I'm worthy of inheriting his power." Aizawa leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest as he studied Izuku with those sharp, calculating eyes. Izuku squirmed under his gaze, unsure of what his teacher-turned-guardian was thinking. He half expected Aizawa to tell him it was a reckless idea, that he wasn't ready, that he should stick to being quirkless and find another path in life. But Aizawa didn't say any of that. Instead, he let out a long sigh, his expression softening just a fraction. "That's a big responsibility, Midoriya. You're not taking this lightly, are you?" Izuku shook his head furiously. "No. I mean, yes, I understand how big this is. I know it's a lot, but I want to try. I want to be a hero, just like All Might." For a moment, Aizawa didn't respond. He simply watched Izuku, his gaze thoughtful. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "It's your decision. But if you're going to do this, you'll need to be prepared for the consequences. Inheriting a quirk like that, it's not just about power. It's about carrying a legacy." Izuku nodded, his heart pounding. "I know. I'm ready to take that on." Hizashi, who had been silent up until now, finally found his voice. Wow, kid. That's amazing. You're gonna be All Might's successor. That's huge. He beamed at Izuku, his enthusiasm infectious. I knew you had it in you, Zuko. Izuku felt a wave of relief wash over him at Hizashi's support, but his gaze quickly returned to Aizawa, who still hadn't fully shown how he felt about the situation. What do you think, Aizawa-sensei? Izuku asked hesitantly, his voice small. Aizawa let out another sigh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I think it's dangerous. But that's what being a hero is, isn't it? You've shown that you're willing to face that danger head-on, even without a quirk. If this is what you want, and if All Might believes you can handle it, then I'm not going to stand in your way. Izuku's eyes widened in surprise. He had expected more resistance, but there was none. Aizawa was letting him choose, trusting him to make his own decision. But, Aizawa added, his tone sharpening, if you're going to take on this responsibility, you're going to need serious training. You can't afford to be reckless with this kind of power. You'll need to learn control, strategy, and how to handle the burden that comes with it. Izuku nodded quickly, his heart swelling with determination. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll train as hard as I can. Aizawa's gaze softened slightly, and for the first time that evening a small, approving smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Good. Because starting tomorrow, you're going to train with me. Izuku's breath caught in his throat. With you? Aizawa nodded. If you're going to inherit a quirk like One for All, you'll need to be able to think and act like a hero. I can't let you charge into danger without a plan. So, you'll be training with me every day after school. Hizashi grinned, leaning forward in his seat. And I'll help too. I'm not letting Shota have all the fun. We're gonna make sure you're ready for whatever comes your way, Zuko. Izuku's heart swelled with gratitude. He had expected resistance, maybe even disappointment, but instead, they were offering their full support. They were going to help him. Thank you, Izuku whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much. Aizawa stood, placing a hand on Izuku's shoulder. Don't thank us yet. You've got a long road ahead of you. But we're here to help you every step of the way. Izuku nodded, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't facing it alone. The next morning, Izuku was up before the sun, his mind buzzing with anticipation. The thought of training with Aizawa sent a shiver of nervousness down his spine, but it was quickly drowned out by excitement. Aizawa's training would be grueling, he knew that, but if it meant becoming strong enough to wield One for All, then he was ready for it. When he stepped into the living room, Aizawa was already there, dressed in his usual black hero suit, his capture weapon wrapped around his shoulders. Hizashi was sitting at the table, sipping his coffee and giving Izuku an encouraging thumbs up. You ready, Zuku? Hizashi asked with a grin. First day of your official training. This is gonna be awesome. Izuku nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. I'm ready. Aizawa didn't say anything at first, but his expression was serious, his gaze sharp as he looked at Izuku. This isn't going to be easy, Midoriya. You're going to need to push yourself harder than you ever have before. I understand, Izuku said, his voice steady. I'm ready to work hard. Aizawa nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. Good. Because we're starting with endurance. You need to build up your body if you're going to handle One for All. I'll be assessing your limits and seeing where we need to focus. The next few hours were some of the hardest Izuku had ever experienced. Aizawa didn't hold back, pushing him to run laps, do push-ups, squats, and every other form of exercise he could think of. Izuku's muscles burned, and his lungs felt like they were on fire, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. This was the beginning of his path to becoming a hero. By the time they were done, Izuku's entire body was trembling with exhaustion, his legs barely able to hold him up. but despite the pain, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. "You did well," Aizawa said, his voice gruff, but approving. "We'll keep building on this, and I'll help you develop your combat strategy." Izuku nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Thank you, Aizawa-sensei." "And don't forget," Hizashi chimed in, popping up beside them with his usual infectious energy. "I'll be helping with your reflexes and mental sharpness. Gotta keep your mind sharp if you're gonna be a hero, right?" Izuku smiled, despite his exhaustion. "Right." As the sun began to set and they made their way back to the apartment, Izuku's body ached, but his heart felt light. This was just the beginning, but he knew, with Aizawa and Hizashi by his side, he could do it. He could become the hero he had always dreamed of being. Chapter 6, The Entrance Exam. Summary. The day of the entrance exam arrives, and both Aizawa and Hizashi are there to support their son. Aizawa struggles to hide his concern, while Hizashi loudly cheers for him from the sidelines. After a grueling test, Izuku secures his place in UA, marking the beginning of a new journey. Back home, there's a quiet moment between the three of them, where Aizawa and Hizashi express their pride and love for Izuku. Story. The day of the UA entrance exam had arrived, and Izuku couldn't help but feel like every nerve in his body was alight with electricity. It wasn't just excitement, although that was certainly part of it, but a deep, gnawing fear that he wasn't ready. Despite the training he had been doing with Aizawa and Hizashi over the past few months, despite the countless mornings where he had pushed his body to its limits, that small, insecure voice in his mind kept whispering that he didn't belong here. He stood at the entrance to UA High School, staring up at the massive gates with wide eyes, his stomach twisting itself into knots. Around him, dozens of other students milled about, many of them confident, chatting excitedly with each other about their quirks and their plans for the future. Izuku, on the other hand, felt as though he might throw up at any second. His hands were clenched tightly into fists at his sides, and he kept replaying all of Aizawa's training instructions in his mind: control your breathing, stay focused, and don't rush in without thinking. But the pressure of the exam, combined with the sheer number of talented, powerful students surrounding him, made it difficult to focus on anything other than his own doubts. Izuku. He jumped slightly at the sound of Hizashi's voice, and turned to see both of his guardians approaching from a distance. Hizashi, as usual, was beaming with excitement, waving energetically as if this were just another one of his radio shows. Aizawa, on the other hand, wore his usual calm, stoic expression, though Izuku could see the slight furrow in his brow. Aizawa was concerned, even if he wasn't showing it outright. "Good luck today, Zuku." Hizashi grinned as he reached him, pulling Izuku into a quick, enthusiastic hug. "This is it. All that hard work, and now it's your time to shine." Aizawa stood beside them, his hands in his pockets as he gave Izuku a slow, measured nod. "You've trained for this. You know what to do. Just keep a level head." Izuku swallowed hard, feeling both the warmth of Hizashi's encouragement and the weight of Aizawa's expectations. He was grateful, so incredibly grateful, that they were here, supporting him in this moment. But at the same time, their presence only made the pressure more intense. He didn't want to let them down. "Thanks," Izuku mumbled, his voice shaky. I'm going to do my best." Hizashi ruffled Izuku's hair, his grin never fading. "Your best is gonna blow them away, Zuku. You've got this." Aizawa's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Izuku. "Remember, don't get reckless. Think before you act. This exam isn't just about strength, it's about strategy." Izuku nodded quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'll remember, Aizawa-sensei." Aizawa stared at him for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight incline of his head, he said, "Good luck." With that, Aizawa and Hizashi stepped back, leaving Izuku alone to face the looming challenge ahead. Izuku watched them for a moment before turning back toward the school, steeling himself. He could do this. He had to do this. As he walked toward the entrance, his legs felt shaky, and the world around him seemed to blur slightly with the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could hear the other students whispering to each other, some talking about their powerful quirks, others strategizing about the exam. Izuku felt like an outsider in his own body, an imposter among real heroes in training. But then he remembered All Might's words, echoing in his mind like a beacon, "You have the heart of a true hero." And Aizawa's steady reminder, "You know what to do." He had trained for this. He wasn't alone. He had one for All Might's power coursing through his veins. That thought grounded him, gave him something to hold on to amid the storm of nerves. Izuku made his way to the large auditorium, where President Mick's voice boomed over the speakers, explaining the details of the exam. Hizashi had always been larger than life in his radio persona, and hearing him in this setting felt surreal. As President Mike explained the point system for defeating robot villains, Izuku clenched his fists. He needed to stay focused on his strategy. This was no time to lose control. When the explanation concluded and the students began to file out toward the exam site, Izuku took a deep breath. This was it. He couldn't afford to let fear get the best of him now. The gates opened, and the students poured into the city-like arena. Massive robots of various sizes patrolled the streets, and almost immediately, students began to activate their quirks, launching into combat. The air was filled with the sounds of explosions, electricity crackling, and the clash of metal. For a moment, Izuku froze. His heart raced as he watched the other students spring into action, their quirks flashing brilliantly in the daylight. This was it, the kind of power he had always dreamed of. And now he had power too. But he had to remember Aizawa's words, "Don't rush in without a plan." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. His muscles tensed as he activated One for All, feeling the energy surge through him. The power was still new to him, and controlling it was difficult, but he could feel its strength pulsing under his skin, waiting to be unleashed. He had to be careful. One wrong move, and he could easily hurt himself, or worse, someone else. Aizawa had drilled that into him during their training, power is meaningless without control. Spotting a large, lumbering robot ahead, Izuku steeled himself. This was his chance. He sprinted forward, his heart pounding in time with his footsteps. The robot turned its head toward him, its mechanical eyes locking onto him as it prepared to attack. With a burst of energy, Izuku leaped into the air, aiming for the robot's weak point. He could feel the power of One for All surging through his limbs as he delivered a powerful punch to the robot's chest. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, and the robot crumpled under the force of the blow, sparks flying from its damaged circuitry. Izuku landed on his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His arms throbbed from the exertion, but he had done it, he had taken down one of the robots. One down. But there wasn't time to celebrate. More robots were approaching, and the other students were quickly racking up points. Izuku's mind raced as he tried to figure out his next move. He couldn't rely solely on brute force, he needed to think strategically. Aizawa had taught him that much. As he scanned the battlefield, looking for opportunities, a scream suddenly pierced the air. Izuku's head snapped in the direction of the sound. One of the other students, a girl with short brown hair, was trapped under the rubble of a collapsed building. A massive, 4-point robot loomed over her, its mechanical arms preparing to strike. Izuku's heart lurched in his chest. Without a second thought, he sprinted toward her, adrenaline pumping through his veins. The robot was massive, much larger than any he had faced so far, but that didn't matter. Someone was in danger. He could feel One for All surging through him again, more powerful than before. His muscles tensed as he charged forward, pushing himself to move faster. The robot's arm swung down, but just before it could strike, Izuku leaped into the air, his fist glowing with the energy of One for All. Smash! The punch connected with the robot's arm, sending it flying backward with a deafening crash. The force of the blow was enough to shatter the robot's frame, and it collapsed into a heap of metal and gears. Izuku landed heavily on the ground, his legs buckling beneath him as the energy from One for All coursed through him. His entire body ached, his arms trembling from the exertion. But he didn't care. The girl, Uraraka, he remembered from the orientation, was safe. She stared up at him in awe, her eyes wide with shock and gratitude. Thank you, she stammered, her voice trembling. Izuku nodded weakly, trying to steady his breathing. It's okay, he said, his voice shaky. Are you hurt? Before she could answer, Present Mick's voice boomed over the speakers. Time's up. The entrance exam is officially over. Izuku collapsed to his knees, his entire body trembling with exhaustion. He had done it. He had saved someone. He had used One for All. But the cost was heavy, his limbs felt like they were on fire, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could stay conscious. As the exam officials rushed in to assess the students, Izuku's vision began to blur. The adrenaline that had kept him going throughout the battle was fading fast, leaving him weak and lightheaded. He could hear the distant sound of someone calling his name, but the world around him was spinning. Before he could process what was happening, everything went black. Underscore 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 underscore. When Izuku awoke, he was in the infirmary, the familiar sterile smell filling his nostrils. His body felt heavy, and every muscle ached, but he was alive. As he blinked his eyes open, he saw Recovery Girl standing beside him, her hands on her hips and a frown on her face. You overdid it, young man, she scolded lightly, though there was a hint of amusement in her voice. But I suppose that's to be expected. Izuku tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in his limbs. Did I pass? He asked, his voice hoarse. Before Recovery Girl could answer, the door to the infirmary swung open, and both Aizawa and Hizashi walked in, their expressions a mix of concern and relief. You're lucky to be alive, kid, Aizawa muttered, his arms crossed over his chest. Hizashi, on the other hand, broke into a wide grin. You were amazing out there, Zuku. You went beyond what we thought was possible. Izuku's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. He had done it. He didn't know the exact results of the exam yet, but he had fought with everything he had, just like they had taught him. Thanks, Izuku whispered, his voice weak but filled with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you. Aizawa's eyes softened, and he gave a small nod of approval. You did well, Midoriya. But next time, try not to destroy yourself in the process. Hizashi laughed, clapping Izuku on the shoulder, gently, of course. You've got a bright future ahead, kid. This is just the beginning. As Izuku lay back against the pillows, a small, tired smile tugged at his lips. The road ahead was still long, and there were many challenges yet to come. But for the first time, he truly believed he could face them. With Aizawa and Hizashi by his side, he wasn't alone anymore. He was part of something bigger, a family, a legacy, and a future filled with possibility. Chapter 7, Family Bonds. Summary. After passing the entrance exam, Izuku reflects on his achievements and the pride he feels from both Aizawa and Hizashi. Aizawa's subtle approval and Hizashi's open praise fill Izuku with a new sense of confidence. He begins to see that his new family believes in him, which helps him believe in himself. Story. It had been 3 days since the UA entrance exam, and Izuku still felt the weight of uncertainty sitting heavily in his chest. Despite everything he had done, despite saving Uraraka and unleashing the power of One for All, he couldn't help but wonder if it had been enough. His performance had been reckless, and he had collapsed afterward. What if it wasn't good enough? What if, after all the training and all the hope, he hadn't made the cut? He sat on the couch in Aizawa and Hizashi's living room, his hands nervously picking at the hem of his shirt. Aizawa was seated in his usual armchair, reading a book, with a cup of tea beside him. Hizashi was on the couch next to Izuku, casually flipping through the channels on the TV, though Izuku could tell that neither of them were fully focused on what they were doing. Hizashi had been trying to keep things light for the past few days, reassuring Izuku at every opportunity that he had done great, that he had blown everyone away during the exam. But Izuku couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he hadn't done enough. Maybe the destruction he had caused would outweigh the good he had done. He had made so many mistakes. Aizawa, on the other hand, had been more reserved. He hadn't said much about the exam, aside from warning Izuku that he had pushed himself too hard. Izuku appreciated Aizawa's honesty, but it only made his doubts grow. What if Aizawa was disappointed? What if he had expected more from Izuku, and now he regretted supporting him? As Izuku sat there, lost in his thoughts, the doorbell rang. All three of them froze. Aizawa slowly lowered his book, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced toward the door. Hizashi paused mid-channel flip, his eyes wide with anticipation. Izuku's heart started to race. He knew what that bell meant. The results of the exam. "I'll get it," Hizashi said, springing up from the couch with a grin. He practically dashed to the door, his usual energy returning in full force. Izuku's stomach twisted into tight knots as he watched Hizashi grab the letter from the mail slot and bring it back to him, holding it out with a flourish. "Here it is, Izuku. The moment of truth." Izuku stared at the envelope in Hizashi's hand, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached out and took it. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of his entire future rested inside. His fingers fumbled slightly as he tore it open, pulling out the letter and unfolding it. A small disc dropped onto his lap, a hologram projector. Izuku's breath hitched in his throat as he realized what this was. He set the letter aside, his hands shaking as he activated the projector. All Might's hologram appeared before him, larger than life as always. "Hello, young Midoriya," the hologram boomed, All Might's familiar grin lighting up the room. "I'm sure you're feeling nervous about the results of the entrance exam, but let me tell you something, there's no need to worry." Izuku's breath caught in his throat. His heart felt like it might burst from his chest. "You performed admirably during the exam," All Might continued, his voice full of pride. "Not only did you display incredible strength and skill, but you showed true heroism by saving one of your fellow examinees. That kind of selflessness is what being a hero is all about." Izuku's eyes widened, his hands tightening around the edges of the projector. Was this it? Did he? "And so," All Might's hologram said, his grin widening, "I am pleased to inform you that you have passed the UA entrance exam. Congratulations, young Midoriya, you're going to be a hero." Izuku stared at the hologram, his mind reeling. He had done it. He had passed. He was going to UA. He was going to become a hero. He was going to become a hero. The weight of it all hit him at once, and tears sprang to his eyes. His chest felt tight with emotion, his hands shaking as he lowered the projector. He had done it. He had really done it. He could hear Hizashi whooping beside him, his usual energy turned up to maximum volume as he threw his arms around Izuku in a tight hug. "You did it, Izuku. I knew you would. I knew it." Izuku laughed through his tears, hugging Hizashi back as tightly as he could. He had never felt so overwhelmed, so relieved, so happy. All the doubt, all the fear, it all melted away in that moment, replaced by a feeling of pure, unfiltered joy. But even through the whirlwind of emotions, Izuku couldn't stop himself from glancing toward Aizawa, who was still sitting in his armchair, watching the scene unfold. Aizawa's face was calm, as always, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Izuku's heart swell even more. Pride. Aizawa slowly stood up, crossing the room toward them. He placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. Well done, Midoriya, he said quietly, his voice steady. You earned this. Izuku looked up at him, his tears blurring his vision. Thank you, Aizawa-sensei. I couldn't have done it without you. Aizawa gave a small nod, but his eyes softened as he looked down at the boy he had taken in months ago, the boy who had grown so much in such a short time. You did this, Midoriya. You worked hard, you pushed yourself, and now you're reaping the rewards. Don't sell yourself short. Izuku blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the fresh wave of tears threatening to spill over. He had never imagined this, never imagined that Aizawa would be standing here, looking at him with such pride, supporting him so fully. Before he could say anything else, Hizashi clapped his hands loudly, breaking the emotional tension. All right. This calls for a celebration. He shot Aizawa a knowing grin. Come on, Shota, I know you've got some fancy tea stashed away. Let's make this official. Aizawa sighed but didn't argue. With a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, he turned and headed toward the kitchen. Hizashi, as usual, bounced along behind him, already chattering excitedly about making dinner to celebrate Izuku's success. Izuku remained on the couch, the hologram still running on the small disc in his hand. All Might's voice echoed in the room, offering more words of encouragement, but Izuku was barely listening anymore. His mind was racing, his heart still pounding with disbelief. He had done it. He was going to UA. As he sat there, staring down at the hologram, a new wave of emotion washed over him, something deeper, more profound than the joy he had felt earlier. He wasn't alone anymore. For so long, he had carried the weight of his dreams on his own, struggling under the pressure of being quirkless, of not being enough. But now, everything was different. Aizawa and Hizashi had taken him in, supported him, and helped him grow into someone he could be proud of. They had become his family. And now, with UA ahead of him, he was no longer just a boy dreaming of being a hero. He was on his way to becoming one. Underscore 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 underscore. The next few days flew by in a blur of preparation and excitement. The official UA acceptance letter arrived in the mail, along with instructions for the first day of school, and Izuku could barely contain his excitement. He spent hours poring over the materials, familiarizing himself with the layout of the school and the schedule for his classes. Hizashi, of course, was thrilled. He helped Izuku pack his things for school, chatting nonstop about what to expect from UA, what kind of teachers he might meet, and how amazing it would be to see him in action as a hero in training. Aizawa, as usual, was more reserved, but he had his own ways of showing his support. He gave Izuku advice on how to approach the first few weeks of school, reminding him to stay focused and not get overwhelmed by the pressure. He also quietly handed Izuku a new pair of shoes the day before school started, noting that his old ones were worn out from all the running and training he had been doing. Izuku was touched by the gesture, and though Aizawa didn't make a big deal out of it, the act spoke volumes. Aizawa wasn't the type to express his emotions openly, but his care for Izuku was clear in the small, thoughtful things he did. Finally, the first day of UA arrived. Izuku stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his new school uniform with shaky hands. He couldn't believe this was real. After everything he had been through, after years of being told he couldn't be a hero, he was standing on the brink of his dream. Zuku. Hizashi's voice called from the hallway. You ready, kiddo? Izuku took a deep breath, staring at his reflection for a moment longer. Then, with a determined nod, he grabbed his backpack and headed out of his room. Hizashi was waiting for him by the door, grinning widely. Aizawa was standing a few feet away, his usual calm demeanor in place, but there was a glint of pride in his eyes that Izuku didn't miss. You're going to be great, Hizashi said, clapping a hand on Izuku's shoulder. Remember, we're proud of you, no matter what. Izuku smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you. Aizawa nodded. Keep your head on straight, and don't let anyone throw you off your game. You've got this, Midoriya. Izuku took a deep breath, steeling himself. I'll do my best. With that, he stepped outside, the sun shining brightly overhead as he made his way toward UA High School. The road ahead was full of challenges, he knew that. But for the first time, he felt ready to face them. With Aizawa and Hizashi by his side, he wasn't just a scared, quirkless boy anymore. He was on his way to becoming a hero. Chapter 8, Class 1A and Secrets. Summary. As Izuku starts his time at UA, he grapples with keeping his new family a secret while building relationships with his classmates. He faces the challenge of balancing his connection to Aizawa and Hizashi with his desire to fit in. The growing tension between Izuku and Bakugo begins to surface, adding to the complexity of his situation. Story. The halls of UA were bustling with activity on Izuku's first day, students swarming around him, all wearing their new uniforms, their faces lit with excitement. As much as Izuku tried to blend into the crowd, the weight of the moment was hard to ignore. His heart raced as he made his way to the room that would become his new home for the next few years, Class 1A. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, dreamed of being a part of the elite, of standing shoulder to shoulder with the future heroes of Japan. And yet, as he approached the door to his classroom, a flicker of doubt wormed its way into his chest. Would he fit in? Would the other students accept him, especially if they found out that he had come from a quirkless background, even with one for all now coursing through him? The door to Class 1A loomed ahead, its imposing size making it feel even more daunting. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He was here. He had made it. This was his chance to prove himself. When he stepped through the door, the classroom was already half full, students chatting amongst themselves. Izuku's eyes immediately darted around the room, recognizing a few faces from the entrance exam. A blond boy with a sharp, confident grin, Kaminari Denki, if he remembered correctly, was laughing with a tall, spiky-haired boy, Kirishima Ijiro. And then there was a more familiar face. Uraraka Ochiko, the girl he had saved during the entrance exam, was sitting near the window, her face lighting up when she spotted him. Izuku. Uraraka called, waving him over. Come sit with me. Izuku hesitated for a moment, still getting used to the idea of being surrounded by so many people, but he smiled and made his way over to her, his heart pounding in his chest. Hey, Uraraka, Izuku said, his voice a little shaky, but filled with relief. You're here too? Of course. Uraraka beamed. I couldn't believe I made it in. I mean, I know you saved me, so I was worried I didn't earn enough points on my own, but then I got the letter and, well, here I am. Izuku nodded, still smiling, but his mind was spinning. He had gotten in, just like everyone else. But the difference was, none of them knew about One for All. They didn't know that All Might had chosen him, or that he was living with two of their teachers, two of the most famous pro-heroes. It was a secret he was going to have to keep carefully, at least for now. As more students filtered in, the classroom grew louder with chatter. Izuku tried to stay calm, though the whirlwind of new faces and voices was overwhelming. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. He wasn't ready for questions about his background, especially about his connection to Aizawa and Hizashi. But just as he was starting to feel like he could blend in, the door swung open with a loud bang, and an all-too-familiar voice filled the room. I'm gonna crush all of you extras. Izuku stiffened in his seat, his heart sinking as he entered the classroom, Kaken. Bakugo Katsuki, with his usual scowl, stomped into the room, his fiery gaze sweeping over everyone. When his eyes landed on Izuku, they narrowed dangerously. Well, Bakugo sneered, stalking toward him. Looks like you managed to weasel your way in here too, Deku. How'd you do it, huh? Cheating? Or did you just get lucky? Izuku's throat went dry, his hands clenched into fists under the desk. He hadn't expected to see Bakugo this soon, and certainly not on the first day. The memories of their past interactions flashed through his mind, years of bullying, of being called weak, of being told he'd never amount to anything. But now wasn't the time to back down. I got in fair and square, Izuku said quietly, his voice wavering slightly. Just like everyone else. Bakugo's eyes flared with anger, but before he could say anything else, a sudden presence filled the room. All conversation stopped as the door slid open once again, and the students turned to see their homeroom teacher enter, Aizawa Shota, in full hero attire. Izuku's heart skipped a beat. Aizawa's tired eyes scanned the room, briefly meeting Izuku's gaze, before moving on. There was no recognition, no change in expression. He was in full eraser head mode, cold, calculated, and distant. No one here knew about their connection. No one knew that Aizawa had taken Izuku in, that they had spent months training together, that they lived in the same apartment. And that's how it had to stay. Quiet down, Aizawa said flatly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. This is Class 1A. You're here to become heroes. If you can't follow basic instructions, you won't last long. The students immediately fell silent, Bakugo included. Izuku's heart was pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to focus. He couldn't afford to mess up, not in front of Aizawa, not in front of his classmates. Aizawa's gaze swept across the room again as he walked to the front of the classroom. You have a long road ahead of you. Don't get cocky just because you passed the entrance exam. Things will only get harder from here. He reached into his bag and pulled out a set of UA gym uniforms, tossing them onto the desk. Get changed. We're doing a quirk assessment test. The class blinked in confusion. Wait, what about the entrance ceremony? Uraraka asked hesitantly. Shouldn't we? Forget about that, Aizawa said, cutting her off. There's no time for ceremonies. Heroes don't wait for pomp and circumstance. Get changed, and meet me outside. The room buzzed with nervous energy as the students gathered their uniforms and filed out of the room. Izuku could feel his hands trembling slightly as he grabbed his uniform and followed the others to the changing rooms. This was it, the first real test. He had to prove himself, not just to his classmates, but to Aizawa as well. As they changed, the other students chatted excitedly about what their quirks could do, trading stories of their past experiences and their goals for the future. Izuku kept to himself, still unsure of how much he should reveal. His quirk, one for all, wasn't like theirs. It was a secret, a legacy handed down from All Might himself. He couldn't let anyone know the truth, not yet. Once they were outside on the training field, Aizawa wasted no time in getting started. He had each student take turns demonstrating their quirks, testing their strength, speed, and control. One by one, they stepped up to the plate, showing off their abilities. Izuku watched in awe as his classmates unleashed their powers. Kirishima turned his body into rock-like armor, Kaminari sent sparks flying from his hands, and Todoroki, an intimidating boy with half-white, half-red hair, used both ice and fire to devastate his targets. But with each demonstration, Izuku's nerves only grew. These people were incredible. Their quirks were strong, flashy, and versatile. What did he have? One for all, a power that he could barely control without breaking his own bones. As the test went on, the students started to notice that Aizawa's gaze lingered on Izuku a little longer than it did on the others. They whispered among themselves, curious about the boy who seemed to have their teacher's attention. Izuku could feel the weight of their stares, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't give anything away. Finally, it was his turn. Aizawa's eyes met his for a brief moment, a silent message passing between them. Don't mess this up. Stay in control. Izuku stepped forward, his heart racing as he prepared himself for the test. He activated One for All, feeling the power surge through his limbs. His muscles tensed, his body buzzing with energy, but he remembered Aizawa's training, control, strategy, restraint. He couldn't afford to let the power overwhelm him. He focused on the task in front of him, launching himself forward with a burst of speed. The air whipped past him as he sprinted toward the target, his fist glowing with the energy of One for All. He aimed carefully, channeling just enough power into his punch to destroy the target without hurting himself. When his fist connected, the target shattered into pieces, the impact sending a shockwave through the air. Izuku skidded to a stop, panting heavily, but still standing. The field fell silent. Aizawa's eyes were unreadable as he stared at Izuku, his expression calm but intense. For a moment, Izuku thought he had failed, that he had done something wrong. But then, slowly, Aizawa gave a small nod of approval. "Well done, Midoriya," Aizawa said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach him. "You're learning." Izuku's heart swelled with pride, a rush of relief washing over him. He had done it. He had stayed in control, just like Aizawa had taught him. But as he turned to rejoin his classmates, he noticed the way they were all staring at him, wide-eyed, shocked, and whispering to each other. "What was that?" one student murmured. "He didn't say what his quirk was." "That was insane," another said, her eyes wide with awe. "How did he do that?" Izuku swallowed hard, trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in his chest. He couldn't let them know the truth, not yet. Not until he was ready. As the test continued, Izuku did his best to stay focused, but the whispers and stares from his classmates were hard to ignore. They were curious about him, suspicious even. And he knew that if he wasn't careful, they might start asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. But for now, he had done what he needed to do. He had passed Aizawa's first test. And as he stood there, surrounded by his new classmates, he realized that this was only the beginning. He still had a long way to go. Chapter 9, Rumors and Rising Tension. Summary. Rumors about Izuku's strength and his connection to certain pro-heroes start to spread within Class 1A. Bakugo becomes increasingly hostile toward Izuku, convinced that he's hiding something. As the UA Sports Festival approaches, the tension between Izuku and his classmates grows, and the pressure to perform mounts. Story. Izuku could feel the weight of their eyes on him. Ever since the quirk assessment test, his classmates had been eyeing him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. No one had outright asked him what his quirk was, but the whispers followed him in the hallways, and the way people looked at him during training exercises made his skin crawl. It wasn't like he wanted to hide anything, but One for All was too big of a secret, too important to just casually share with anyone. He caught snippets of conversations whenever he walked by. "What's his deal? His quirk's so strong, but he doesn't talk about it. He's always so nervous, maybe he's just not used to having power. I heard he's close to some of the teachers." Rumors. They clung to him like a second skin, making it hard to breathe, to relax. The worst of it, though, came from Kaken. "Oi, Deku." Bakugo's voice rang out, sharp and grating, from across the training ground where they were preparing for an afternoon sparring session. Izuku tensed as he turned to face his childhood tormentor, his heart thudding in his chest. Bakugo's sneer was as cruel as ever, his crimson eyes narrowed into slits. "You think you're hot shit now, huh? Just because you managed to pull something off at the quirk test?" Izuku opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. He had trained for this moment, spent hours under Aizawa's watchful eye, learning to control One for All in small, manageable bursts. But no amount of training prepared him for the knot that twisted in his gut whenever Bakugo was around. "I don't," Izuku started, but Bakugo cut him off. "Don't give me that crap," Bakugo snarled, taking a threatening step forward. "I know you're hiding something, Deku. No way someone like you suddenly pulls off that kind of power without cheating. What is it, huh? What dirty little secret are you keeping? Izuku's fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms. He couldn't reveal the truth. He couldn't tell Bakugo about One for All, about All Might, about everything that had changed since they were kids. But Bakugo wasn't making it easy. I'm not hiding anything, Izuku said quietly, his voice wavering despite his best efforts to stay calm. Bakugo's scowl deepened, his hands crackling with the beginnings of explosions. Don't lie to me, Deku. You're too pathetic to have a quirk like that. You've always been weak, and now you think you can just show up at UA and pretend to be a hero? The words stung, like they always did. But this time Izuku didn't back down. He was different now. He was strong. He had the power to prove it. But before he could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tension. Bakugo, stand down. Izuku's heart lurched as he turned to see Aizawa standing at the edge of the training ground, his eyes narrowed and his voice cool as ice. Aizawa didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone was unmistakable. Bakugo shot Izuku one last glare, before backing off, though the anger still simmered in his eyes. "Tch whatever," Bakugo muttered, turning and stalking away. Izuku let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders sagging with relief. He met Aizawa's gaze, and though his teacher's expression was unreadable, there was something in his eyes, something like concern. Aizawa approached, his steps measured and quiet, before stopping in front of Izuku. "You're letting him get under your skin," Aizawa said, his voice low but firm. "You can't let people like Bakugo shake your focus." I know," Izuku mumbled, looking down at his feet. "It's just hard." Aizawa's eyes softened slightly. "You've got a lot on your shoulders. More than most people know. But if you keep letting the pressure get to you, it's going to break you." Izuku nodded, the weight of Aizawa's words sinking in. He knew Aizawa was right. Between keeping the secret of One for All and navigating his growing responsibilities at UA, it was all starting to feel overwhelming. "I'll try harder, Aizawa-sensei," Izuku said quietly, his voice filled with determination. Aizawa's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, before he gave a slight nod. "You don't have to carry this alone, you know. You've got support, use it." With that, Aizawa turned and walked away, leaving Izuku to process the moment. The tension in his chest loosened slightly. Aizawa always knew how to get through to him, even without saying much. Still, the anxiety clung to him, like a cloud he couldn't shake. Bakugo was only one part of the problem. The other part was the growing pressure of his classmates' curiosity. They were starting to notice the way Aizawa seemed to watch him a little more closely during training, the way Hizashi always gave him an extra bit of encouragement in the hallways. It wouldn't take long for someone to connect the dots. And then there was the UA Sports Festival, which loomed on the horizon like a storm he couldn't avoid. When the announcement came that afternoon, it only heightened Izuku's nerves. The sports festival was one of the most important events of the school year, a chance for students to showcase their abilities to pro heroes and agencies. It was also a chance for Izuku to prove himself in front of a massive audience. But with that opportunity came the terrifying reality that the whole world would be watching him. His classmates, his teachers, pro heroes, even the media, they'd all have their eyes on him. And if he wasn't careful, they might start asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. That evening, Izuku sat at the dinner table with Aizawa and Hizashi, his mind racing with thoughts of the sports festival. Hizashi was his usual boisterous self, chatting animatedly about how exciting the event was going to be, but Aizawa was quieter than usual, his sharp eyes flicking to Izuku every now and then. "Hey, Zuku," Hizashi said, pulling Izuku out of his thoughts. "You're looking a little pale. Nervous about the festival?" Izuku bit his lip, nodding. "A little. It's a lot of pressure." Hizashi's grin softened into something more reassuring. "You're gonna be great, kiddo. You've been training like crazy, and you've got what it takes to shine out there. Just be yourself. Izuku smiled weakly, appreciating Hizashi's optimism. But deep down, the fear still gnawed at him. Aizawa set his chopsticks down, his eyes locking onto Izuku with that piercing gaze that always made Izuku feel like his teacher could see right through him. The sports festival is going to test more than just your physical abilities, Aizawa said, his voice measured. It's a mental game, too. You'll be performing in front of a large audience, and you need to stay focused. Don't let the pressure crack you. I won't, Izuku promised, though his voice wavered slightly. Aizawa didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. Remember, Midoriya, you've got more control over One for All now than you did when you started. Use it wisely. Don't overextend yourself. Izuku nodded, grateful for Aizawa's advice. He had been working hard to master his new quirk, learning to harness its power in smaller doses, without breaking his body in the process. But the thought of using One for All in front of so many people who had no idea what it truly was daunting. After dinner, Izuku retreated to his room, his mind still buzzing with thoughts of the festival. As he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he could hear Hizashi and Aizawa talking quietly in the living room. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew they were talking about him. He sighed, turning over onto his side. Tomorrow, his training would continue. Tomorrow, the countdown to the sports festival would begin in earnest. And tomorrow, he'd have to prove, to Bakugo, to his classmates, to the world, that he belonged at UA. Chapter 10, The UA Sports Festival Begins. Summary. The UA Sports Festival kicks off with an obstacle race. Izuku's anxiety is at an all-time high, but he pushes through the fear, competing alongside Todoroki, Bakugo, and the rest of Class 1A. The race is a physical and mental test, and Izuku barely manages to keep up, using his wits to navigate the obstacles while conserving his energy for later stages. Story. The morning of the UA Sports Festival dawned bright and clear, the sun hanging high in the sky, as if even nature itself was eager for the day's events. Izuku stood at the entrance to the stadium, his heart hammering in his chest. The massive structure loomed before him, packed with students, spectators, and pro-heroes from all over the country. He could hear the excited murmur of the crowd, the cheers and chants already echoing through the air. This was the moment. The moment where he'd either prove himself or fail in front of everyone, his classmates, his teachers, the pros, the media, and the world. Hizashi had tried to lighten the mood earlier that morning, throwing out his usual barrage of enthusiastic pep talks and jokes over breakfast, but even he could sense the tension in the air. Aizawa, for his part, had been calm and serious, reminding Izuku to stay focused and to control his power. But now, standing at the gates of the festival, it all felt overwhelming. As he looked around, he saw his classmates from Class 1A gathering nearby. Uraraka waved at him from across the way, her smile as bright and cheerful as ever. Next to her, Ida was already talking animatedly, his arms gesturing with his usual precision and discipline. Todoroki stood a little further off, his cold gaze sweeping over the crowd, while Kurashima and Kaminari were already hyping each other up with a flurry of excited fist bumps. Everyone looked ready. Everyone looked confident. Izuku, on the other hand, felt like he was going to be sick. What if I mess up? The thought gnawed at him like a festering wound. What if I lose control of One for All? What if I get hurt? What if I embarrass Aizawa and Hizashi? He swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. The pressure was suffocating. Before he could let his thoughts spiral any further, a familiar voice boomed across the stadium speakers, loud and energetic. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Present, Mick's voice echoed through the arena. Welcome to the UA Sports Festival, where the future heroes of Japan will show us what they're made of. Are you ready for some action? The crowd erupted into cheers, the roar of excitement reverberating through the stadium like a tidal wave. Izuku could feel the vibrations in his bones, the sheer energy of it all making his heart race even faster. Present Mick's voice continued, lively as ever. Today's festivities will kick off with our first-year students. Get ready to witness some incredible talent, folks. The students were ushered into the main stadium, where they lined up behind the podium. The noise from the crowd was deafening, but Izuku barely noticed it. His mind was too focused on what lay ahead, the competition, the challenges, the endless unknowns. Standing at the front of the podium, Midnight, the R-rated hero, took center stage. Her whip cracked in the air as she silenced the crowd, a grin playing on her lips as she addressed the students. Welcome, first years, Midnight purred, her voice commanding. As you know, the UA Sports Festival is one of the most important events in your hero training. You'll be competing against each other in a series of challenges designed to test your strength, your skills, and your resolve. Remember, pro heroes are watching, and this is your chance to make a name for yourselves. Izuku swallowed hard. No pressure, right? Midnight continued, her grin widening. The first event is an obstacle race. You'll all start together, but only the top 42 students will move on to the next round. So give it your all. An obstacle race. Izuku's mind immediately started running through potential strategies. Speed and agility were key, but he couldn't just rely on brute force. He needed to conserve his energy, use one for all in short bursts without hurting himself. He couldn't afford to get reckless. Take your positions. Midnight called, gesturing toward the starting line. Izuku took a deep breath, his legs trembling slightly as he stepped up to the starting line with the rest of his class. He glanced to his right, where Bakugo was glaring at him with his usual intensity, his hands already sparking with explosions. On his left, Todoroki stood with his hands at his sides, calm and collected, his mismatched eyes focused straight ahead. This was it. The starting gun was about to go off. Izuku's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He could feel the weight of one for all buzzing under his skin, ready to be unleashed. But he had to be careful. He had to control it. Just stay focused, he told himself. You've trained for this. You can do this. The gun went off, and the race began. The first wave of competitors surged forward, and Izuku found himself running alongside them, his feet pounding against the ground. The wind whipped past him as he pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort. All around him, students were activating their quirks, some flying, some teleporting, others using brute force to smash through obstacles. Todoroki was already pulling ahead, his eyes spreading across the ground, freezing the other competitors in their tracks. Bakugo shot through the air with his explosions, a trail of smoke following in his wake. Kirishima barreled through a wall of debris, his hardened skin protecting him from the impact. Izuku's mind raced as he dodged and weaved through the chaos. He couldn't afford to fall behind, but he also couldn't afford to burn himself out too quickly. One for all buzzed under his skin, begging to be used, but he held back, waiting for the right moment. The first major obstacle loomed ahead, a field of massive, spider-like robots, the same kind they had faced in the entrance exam. The students around him hesitated, trying to figure out the best way to get past them without being crushed. Izuku's heart raced as he watched the robots move, their mechanical limbs clanging against the ground with earth-shaking force. He had to time this perfectly. He activated one for all in his legs, feeling the familiar surge of power as he launched himself into the air, soaring over the robots. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. The wind whipped through his hair as he flew above the chaos, his body weightless. He could see the entire field below him, students dodging, leaping, and blasting their way through the obstacles. But as he descended, he realized his landing was going to be tricky. He adjusted his trajectory, aiming for a gap between two robots. When he hit the ground, he let the momentum carry him forward, rolling to avoid the brunt of the impact. Pain shot through his legs, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. There was no time to stop. He had to keep moving. Behind him, he heard the roar of Bakugo's explosions and the sharp crackle of Todoroki's ice as they continued to tear through the course. Izuku focused on the next obstacle, a massive canyon, too wide to jump without a boost. His breath hitched. He had to use one for all again. He pushed the power into his legs, preparing to leap. The energy surged through him, the familiar tingling sensation spreading up his spine as he propelled himself into the air. Don't break anything, he thought desperately as he sailed over the canyon, his heart pounding in his chest. Midnight continued, her grin widening. The first event is an obstacle race. You'll all start together, but only the top 42 students will move on to the next round. So give it your all. An obstacle race. Izuku's mind immediately started running through potential strategies. Speed and agility were key, but he couldn't just rely on brute force. He needed to conserve his energy, use one for all in short bursts without hurting himself. He couldn't afford to get reckless. Take your positions. Midnight called, gesturing toward the starting line. Izuku took a deep breath, his legs trembling slightly as he stepped up to the starting line with the rest of his class. He glanced to his right, where Bakugo was glaring at him with his usual intensity, his hands already sparking with explosions. On his left, Todoroki stood with his hands at his sides, calm and collected, his mismatched eyes focused straight ahead. This was it. The starting gun was about to go off. Izuku's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He could feel the weight of one for all buzzing under his skin, ready to be unleashed. But he had to be careful. He had to control it. Just stay focused, he told himself. You've trained for this. You can do this. The gun went off, and the race began. The first wave of competitors surged forward, and Izuku found himself running alongside them, his feet pounding against the ground. The wind whipped past him as he pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort. All around him, students were activating their quirks, some flying, some teleporting, others using brute force to smash through obstacles. Todoroki was already pulling ahead, his eyes spreading across the ground, freezing the other competitors in their tracks. Bakugo shot through the air with his explosions, a trail of smoke following in his wake. Kirishima barreled through a wall of debris, his hardened skin protecting him from the impact. Izuku's mind raced as he dodged and weaved through the chaos. He couldn't afford to fall behind, but he also couldn't afford to burn himself out too quickly. One for all buzzed under his skin, begging to be used, but he held back, waiting for the right moment. The first major obstacle loomed ahead, a field of massive, spider-like robots, the same kind they had faced in the entrance exam. The students around him hesitated, trying to figure out the best way to get past them without being crushed. Izuku's heart raced as he watched the robots move, their mechanical limbs clanging against the ground with earth-shaking force. He had to time this perfectly. He activated one for all in his legs, feeling the familiar surge of power as he launched himself into the air, soaring over the robots. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. The wind whipped through his hair as he flew above the chaos, his body weightless. He could see the entire field below him, students dodging, leaping, and blasting their way through the obstacles. But as he descended, he realized his landing was going to be tricky. He adjusted his trajectory, aiming for a gap between two robots. When he hit the ground, he let the momentum carry him forward, rolling to avoid the brunt of the impact. Pain shot through his legs, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. There was no time to stop. He had to keep moving. Behind him, he heard the roar of Bakugo's explosions and the sharp crackle of Todoroki's ice as they continued to tear through the course. Izuku focused on the next obstacle, a massive canyon, too wide to jump without a boost. His breath hitched. He had to use one for all again. He pushed the power into his legs, preparing to leap. The energy surged through him, the familiar tingling sensation spreading up his spine as he propelled himself into the air. Don't break anything, he thought desperately as he sailed over the canyon, his heart pounding in his chest. Chapter 11, A Test of Will. Summary. The second stage of the sports festival, a cavalry battle, forces Izuku to rely on teamwork and strategy. He builds a team with Uraraka, Ida, and Tokoyami, using their abilities to stay competitive. Bakugo's relentless pursuit puts pressure on Izuku, but he manages to outmaneuver his rival, showing his growth as a leader and strategist. Story. The roar of the crowd still rang in Izuku's ears as he sat in the waiting room, nursing the pain in his wrist. The aftermath of the obstacle race had left him both physically and mentally drained, but there was no time to rest. The next stage of the UA Sports Festival was about to begin, and the pressure weighing on him was heavier than ever. He'd done better than he expected in the first round, finishing in third place behind Todoroki and Bakugo, but it wasn't enough to ease his nerves. His classmates had performed brilliantly, each of them showcasing their unique quirks in ways that left the audience, and Izuku, amazed. And yet, even with that small victory, he couldn't help but feel the looming expectations pressing down on him. Everyone's watching. Aizawa-sensei, Hizashi-sensei, All Might. He clenched his fist, wincing at the sharp pain in his wrist. He'd gone too hard on the barrier back there, but Recovery Girl had already patched him up. Still, the ache was a reminder of just how fragile his control over One for All was. One mistake, and he could easily break himself in front of everyone. The door to the waiting room slid open, and Uraraka stepped inside, her face lit up with her usual bright smile. Midoriya. There you are. Izuku looked up, trying to hide his nervousness behind a shaky smile. Oh, hey, Uraraka. You were amazing out there, she said, plopping down beside him. I can't believe you kept up with Bakugo and Todoroki. You were so fast. Izuku blushed slightly, rubbing the back of his neck. Thanks. You did great too. I saw how you dodged all those traps at the end. Uraraka's smile widened. Well, I couldn't let everyone else have all the fun, right? The two shared a quiet laugh, the tension between them easing for a moment. But as the silence settled, Izuku's thoughts drifted back to the next round of the festival. His stomach churned at the thought of what lay ahead. You nervous about the next round? Uraraka asked, her tone softening. Izuku sighed, nodding. Yeah. I mean, the obstacle race was one thing, but whatever comes next. I don't know if I can handle it. Uraraka frowned slightly, her eyes filled with understanding. I get it. This whole thing is a lot of pressure. But you've worked so hard, Midoriya. You've got this. Her words were kind, but Izuku couldn't shake the gnawing fear inside him. What if he lost control? What if he hurt someone? He'd managed to keep One for All in check so far, but the sports festival wasn't over yet. There were still so many unknowns. Before he could say anything else, a loud voice echoed through the stadium speakers, cutting through the air. All right, listeners, it's time for the second stage of the festival. Present Mick's voice boomed, full of energy and excitement. This time, our first-year students are in for a real challenge. Get ready for the cavalry battle. Izuku's heart skipped a beat. A cavalry battle? He glanced at Uraraka, who looked just as confused as he felt. A cavalry battle was a team-based event, meaning he'd have to rely on others to support him, and he'd have to make sure he didn't overdo it with One for All. The stakes were even higher now. As the announcement continued, Aizawa's voice cut in, calm and direct. For this battle, each of you will be assigned a point value based on your rank from the first round. Your objective is to gather as many points as possible by stealing headbands from other teams. But here's the catch, the person in first place will have a headband worth 10 million points. Izuku froze, his blood running cold. 10 million points? He was in third place, but that meant. His eyes darted to Todoroki, who stood across the waiting area, his expression unreadable. The entire stadium seemed to buzz with anticipation as the realization sank in: Todoroki, the top student, was going to be the main target. And then Bakugo's voice cut through the noise. TCH. Like hell, I'm letting Icy Hot take all the attention. I'm going for first. Izuku watched as Bakugo's hand sparked with tiny explosions, his expression filled with determination and rage. The thought of being on the receiving end of that intensity made Izuku's heart race even faster. 10 million points. Everyone would be after Todoroki. And everyone would be after whoever was closest to him. The pressure was suffocating. As the students began to gather in teams, Izuku stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. His mind raced with strategies, trying to figure out how to approach the battle. He needed allies, but who would want to team up with him? He wasn't the fastest or the strongest. And if he messed up, he could ruin it for everyone. Suddenly, a familiar voice pulled him out of his thoughts. Midoriya. Ida called, approaching him with that familiar, serious expression. Have you formed a team yet? Izuku blinked, shaking his head. And no, I haven't. Ida's eyes narrowed thoughtfully before he nodded. Let's form a team. I trust your judgment, Midoriya. I believe we can work well together. Before Izuku could respond, Uraraka chimed in. I'm in too. We worked well together before, right? Izuku's chest tightened with relief. Ida and Uraraka. Two people he trusted. That was a start. But they still needed one more person. As they began to scan the room for potential teammates, a voice came from behind them. Need a fourth? They all turned to see Tokoyami, his dark, bird-like figure looming in the shadows. His quirk, Dark Shadow, shifted slightly behind him, its sharp eyes gleaming with interest. Izuku hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. Tokoyami's quirk was powerful, and he seemed level-headed. They could use that. Yeah, Izuku said. We could definitely use your help. With their team assembled, they quickly went over their strategy. The goal was to stay away from the larger threats, namely Bakugo and Todoroki, while keeping their own headbands safe. Ida would handle speed, Uraraka would help with weightlessness to keep them agile, and Tokoyami would use Dark Shadow for defense. But Izuku knew that the real challenge would be controlling one for all. He had to be careful. If he overdid it, he could ruin everything for his team. The buzzer rang, signaling the start of the cavalry battle. Chaos erupted immediately. Students charged at each other, teams colliding as they fought for control of the headbands. The air was filled with the sounds of explosions, blasts of fire and ice, and the clash of quirks. Izuku's heart pounded as he and his team darted around the arena, trying to avoid the main skirmishes. Bakugo's team was tearing through the competition, his explosions sending opponents flying as he charged toward Todoroki's team with reckless abandon. Todoroki, on the other hand, was methodical, using his ice to trap teams in place and steal their headbands with calculated precision. Izuku's team managed to stay out of the main conflict for most of the battle, collecting a few smaller headbands along the way. But as the timer ticked down, it became clear that they would need more points if they wanted to make it to the next round. And then, to Izuku's horror, Bakugo's team spotted them. Deku! Bakugo roared, his eyes blazing with fury as he shot toward them, explosions propelling him forward like a rocket. I'm coming for you! Izuku's heart skipped a beat, and panic surged through him. He's too fast. We can't outrun him. Midoriya! Ida shouted, his voice urgent. We need a plan. Izuku's mind raced. He could feel one for all humming under his skin, begging to be unleashed. But he couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Not when his team was counting on him. Suddenly, an idea clicked into place. Ida, use your quirk to boost us forward. Uraraka, make us lighter, just for a second. Ida's engines roared to life, and Uraraka's power took effect, making their movements almost weightless. Izuku could feel the rush of air as they shot forward, just barely dodging Bakugo's attack. But Bakugo wasn't giving up. You can't run forever, Deku, he snarled, launching himself into the air once more. Izuku gritted his teeth. He didn't want to do this, but there was no other choice. He activated One for All, feeling the power surge through his legs. With one powerful burst, he launched himself into the air, aiming to distract Bakugo long enough for his team to escape. For a brief moment, the world seemed to slow down. Izuku could see Bakugo's furious expression as their eyes met, the raw intensity of his explosions crackling in the air. But Izuku wasn't backing down. Not this time. With a swift movement, he swung his arm, unleashing a small, controlled burst of power that sent a shockwave rippling through the air. It wasn't enough to cause damage, but it was enough to throw Bakugo off balance. Bakugo cursed as he lost control of his trajectory, crashing to the ground in a burst of smoke. Izuku landed heavily, the impact jarring his already sore body. But it didn't matter. His team was still in the game. The final buzzer sounded, signaling the end of the round. Izuku collapsed to his knees, panting heavily. His body ached, his muscles trembling from the strain of using One for All, but they had done it. They had survived. As the dust settled, Midnight's voice echoed across the stadium. The second round is over. The teams moving on to the next round are. Izuku barely heard the rest of the announcement. All he could think about was the fact that they had made it through. They had worked together, and they had won. But as he looked up, his eyes met Bakugo's once again. The anger in Bakugo's gaze hadn't faded, it had only grown. You think this is over, Deku? Bakugo growled, his voice low and dangerous. Just wait. I'm coming for you in the next round. Izuku swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. The next round was going to be even harder. And he wasn't sure if he was ready. Chapter 12, The Clash of Titans. Summary. In the one-on-one tournament, Izuku faces Todoroki in a fierce battle that pushes both of them to their limits. Izuku encourages Todoroki to use his fire, breaking through Todoroki's emotional barriers and helping him embrace his full power. Despite losing the match, Izuku's influence on Todoroki marks a turning point for both characters. Story. The aftermath of the cavalry battle left Izuku both relieved and exhausted. His team had survived the chaos, and they had secured enough points to move on to the final event. But as much as he wanted to savor that victory, Bakugo's furious words echoed in his mind. Just wait. I'm coming for you in the next round. Izuku stood in the locker room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. His face was still flushed from the adrenaline of the battle, his hands shaking slightly as he clenched them into fists. The weight of One for All still buzzed under his skin, a constant reminder of the power he was holding back, power he needed to control if he wanted to make it through the next round. The final event was a one-on-one tournament, a direct showdown between the top competitors. It was the part of the UA Sports Festival that everyone had been waiting for, and the pressure was mounting. Each student would face off against another in a battle that tested not only their quirk, but their willpower and strategy. The thought of it made Izuku's stomach churn. He glanced around the locker room, where some of his classmates were finishing up their preparations. Todoroki stood near the back, silent and calm as always, his eyes focused and distant. Kirishima was giving Kaminari an encouraging pat on the back, his usual boisterous energy filling the space. Even Bakugo, who had stormed into the room earlier, was now pacing back and forth, his fists clenched and sparks of explosions flickering at his fingertips. Everyone was ready. Everyone was tense. Izuku swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. You all right, Midoriya? Izuku turned to see Ida standing nearby, his usual serious expression softened with concern. Ida adjusted his glasses as he approached, his sharp gaze flicking over Izuku's tense posture. You've been quiet, Ida continued. I know the tournament is a lot of pressure, but you've done well so far. You should be proud. Izuku forced a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah. There's so much at stake, and I don't know if I can. You can, Ida interrupted, his tone firm but encouraging. You've worked hard for this. We've all seen it. You belong here, Midoriya. Don't doubt yourself now. Izuku blinked in surprise at Ida's words, feeling a flicker of warmth in his chest. He hadn't realized just how much he needed to hear that. His smile grew a little more genuine this time. Thanks, Ida. That really means a lot. Ida gave a sharp nod, his expression resolute. Good. Now, let's focus on the task at hand. We've got a tournament to win. Izuku chuckled weakly, but the anxiety in his chest didn't fully dissipate. As much as he appreciated Ida's confidence in him, the truth was that the next round would be different from anything he'd faced so far. He couldn't afford to hold back, but he also couldn't afford to lose control. As they made their way back to the stadium, Izuku's thoughts were racing. The brackets for the tournament had already been posted, and he knew who his first opponent would be, Todoroki. Izuku's stomach dropped at the thought. Todoroki's quirk was on a completely different level. The sheer power of his ice and fire made him one of the strongest competitors in the class, and the way he had dominated the obstacle race and the cavalry battle only reinforced that fact. Facing him in a one-on-one match felt like a mountain Izuku wasn't sure he could climb. But he didn't have a choice. This was the reality of UA, the reality of being a hero. He would face overwhelming odds again and again, and he had to rise to meet them. The tournament began with the roar of the crowd filling the stadium, their cheers and chants echoing across the field. Midnight stood at the center of the stage, her whip cracking in the air as she called for the first competitors to step forward. Izuku's heart raced as he made his way toward the arena. His body felt heavy, weighed down by the pressure of the moment, but he forced himself to keep moving. Each step felt like 1,000 pounds, but he couldn't back down now. Not after everything he'd been through. Not after coming this far. Todoroki was already waiting at the center of the arena, his expression unreadable as his mismatched eyes focused on Izuku. The temperature around him seemed to drop slightly, the air growing colder with each passing second. His left side, the one that wielded fire, remained dormant as always, while his right side crackled with the icy power he had demonstrated so many times before. Izuku swallowed hard. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. As the crowd quieted, Midnight's voice rang out across the arena. Let the first match of the tournament begin. The moment the words left her mouth, Todoroki moved. A wall of ice surged toward Izuku, massive and fast, threatening to engulf him in an instant. Izuku's eyes widened in shock, but he reacted on instinct, activating One for All and leaping into the air just before the ice could reach him. He barely had time to catch his breath, before Todoroki sent another wave of ice crashing toward him, forcing Izuku to dodge again. The ground beneath him froze over, turning the arena into a winter wasteland. Every movement felt sluggish, his muscles straining to keep up with the relentless assault. He's not holding back at all, Izuku realized, panic bubbling up in his chest. Todoroki was coming at him with everything he had, and Izuku was barely keeping up. His mind raced, trying to come up with a strategy. He couldn't go head-to-head with Todoroki's ice, not without risking serious injury. But he also couldn't afford to stay on the defensive for too long. If he wanted to win, he had to find an opening. But Todoroki wasn't giving him one. Another wave of ice shot toward him, and this time, Izuku had no choice but to activate One for All in his legs, sending a burst of power through his body as he launched himself forward, shattering the ice beneath him. The impact sent a shockwave rippling through the arena, but Todoroki remained unfazed. Izuku charged toward him, his heart pounding. He could feel the power of One for All buzzing under his skin, begging to be unleashed. But he had to be careful. He couldn't afford to lose control. He swung his arm, aiming for a punch, but Todoroki was ready. A massive wall of ice shot up between them, blocking Izuku's attack and sending a cold blast of air into his face. Izuku skidded to a stop, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was already tiring, and they hadn't even been fighting for long. Todoroki's ice was relentless, and Izuku's muscles were screaming from the effort of dodging and countering. I can't keep this up, Izuku thought, panic creeping in. He's too fast, and I'm wasting too much energy trying to keep up. He had to do something. He had to break through. As Todoroki prepared another attack, Izuku's mind raced. He couldn't beat Todoroki at his own game, but there was something else, something Todoroki wasn't using. Todoroki's fire. Izuku's eyes widened as the realization hit him. Todoroki had only been using his ice throughout the entire match. His left side, the side that wielded fire, remained completely untouched. He was holding back. Why isn't he using his fire? The thought gnawed at Izuku's mind, even as he dodged another wave of ice. He knew Todoroki was powerful, incredibly powerful. But by refusing to use his fire, he was limiting himself. And in a match like this, where every advantage counted, it didn't make sense. Why aren't you using your fire, Todoroki? Izuku shouted, his voice cutting through the cold air. Todoroki's eyes flicked toward him, a flash of surprise crossing his face, but he didn't respond. Why are you holding back? Izuku yelled again, his voice filled with desperation. You've got all this power, but you're not using all of it. Why? Todoroki's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. I'm not like you, Midoriya. Izuku's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean? I'm going to win this tournament using only my mother's power, Todoroki said coldly, his voice laced with bitterness. I won't use my father's fire. I refuse. Izuku blinked in shock, Todoroki's words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had heard rumors about Todoroki's father, Endeavor, the number 2 hero, but hearing it confirmed like this. But you're not your father, Izuku said quietly, his voice trembling. You don't have to be. Todoroki's eyes flashed with anger. That's easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like. You don't know what kind of man he is. Izuku's heart ached at the pain in Todoroki's voice. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for Todoroki, growing up in the shadow of someone like Endeavor. But at the same time, he couldn't let Todoroki hold himself back like this. If you want to win, you have to use all of your power, Izuku said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. Not just your ice. Not just one part of yourself. All of it. Todoroki's expression wavered, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. For a moment, Izuku thought he had gotten through to him. But then, Todoroki's gaze hardened once more. I don't need his power to beat you, Todoroki said, his voice cold. With a wave of his hand, another massive wall of ice shot toward Izuku. Izuku's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't dodge this one. It was too fast, too big. This is it, he thought, panic surging through him. He activated one for all in his legs, preparing to jump, but just as he moved, his foot slipped on the frozen ground. His balance wavered, and in that split second of hesitation, the ice slammed into him. The force of the impact sent him flying across the arena, crashing into the ground with a sickening thud. Pain exploded through Izuku's body, his vision blurring as he struggled to breathe. His chest ached, his limbs felt heavy, and his head spun with dizziness. He could barely move. The crowd had gone silent. Izuku lay there, gasping for air, his mind racing. He could hear Midnight's voice distantly, counting down to declare Todoroki the winner. But he couldn't give up. He couldn't let it end like this. With a groan of effort, Izuku forced himself to move. His body screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He had to get up. He had to keep fighting. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The pain in his chest was excruciating, but he grit his teeth and pushed through it. I can't lose. Not here. Not now. The countdown continued. 5, 4, 3. Get up. Get up, get up, get up. Izuku staggered to his feet, his vision swimming. He could barely see straight, but he didn't care. He wasn't going to give up. Not yet. He activated One for All once more, the power surging through him like fire. With a roar of determination, he charged toward Todoroki, his fist glowing with energy. Todoroki's eyes widened in surprise as Izuku closed the distance between them, but he didn't have time to react. Izuku swung his fist with all the strength he had left, aiming for the center of Todoroki's ice wall. Smash! The wall shattered, sending shards of ice flying in every direction. The crowd erupted into cheers. But as Izuku stood there, panting heavily, the last of his energy spent, he knew he couldn't fight anymore. His body was too battered, too broken. And Todoroki wasn't finished. With a final, cold glance, Todoroki raised his hand, sending a blast of ice toward Izuku. Izuku didn't even have the strength to dodge. The ice hit him square in the chest, and everything went black. Chapter 13, The Weight of Defeat. Summary. After his defeat, Izuku struggles with feelings of failure. Recovery Girl helps him understand that pushing himself too far isn't the same as giving his all. Aizawa and Hizashi offer comfort, showing him that success isn't measured by victory but by the effort he puts in and the impact he has on others. Todoroki's gratitude after their fight further reinforces Izuku's growth. Story. When Izuku awoke, his body felt like it had been run over by a freight train. Every muscle ached, every breath sent a sharp pain through his chest, and his head throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. The soft, sterile smell of the infirmary filled his nose, and when he finally forced his eyes open, the first thing he saw was the familiar figure of Recovery Girl standing over him, her lips set in a tight line. Well, young man, she said, her voice stern but not unkind, you've certainly done it this time. Pushed yourself too far again, didn't you? Izuku groaned softly, trying to sit up, but his body protested with a sharp wave of pain. He sank back into the pillows, his mind foggy from both exhaustion and confusion. The memories of his fight with Todoroki were blurry, but the crushing weight of defeat settled heavily on his chest. He had lost. Even after everything, after pushing himself to his limits, Todoroki had been too strong. Izuku tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and the words came out hoarse. Did Todoroki win? Recovery Girl sighed, patting his arm gently. Yes, he did. You put up quite a fight, though. That last punch of yours almost turned the tide, but he had too much left in him, and you were already on the verge of collapse. Izuku stared up at the ceiling, the weight of her words sinking in. He had failed. He had given everything he had, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. The frustration gnawed at him, mixing with the physical pain coursing through his body. He had tried to help Todoroki, tried to get him to use his fire and accept all of himself, but in the end, it hadn't changed the outcome. I couldn't beat him, Izuku muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands clenched weakly at the sheets, a wave of helplessness washing over him. Recovery Girl gave him a long, steady look, her expression softening slightly. You may have lost the match, young man, but you haven't failed. You showed incredible determination, and you pushed Todoroki harder than anyone else has. There's more to being a hero than winning every fight. You're learning that now. Izuku swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to well up in his eyes. He had wanted to prove himself, to show everyone that he was worthy of being at UA, of being All Might's successor, of being a hero. But now, all he felt was the bitter sting of defeat. Before he could dwell on the thought any longer, the door to the infirmary slid open with a soft hiss, and two familiar figures stepped inside. Hizashi was the first to speak, his usual booming voice softened by concern. "Yo, Zuku. You alright, kiddo? You had us worried for a sec." Izuku turned his head slightly, forcing a weak smile as Hizashi approached the bed, his usual energetic demeanor toned down. The bright, flashy hero crouched down beside him, giving him a careful once-over, as if making sure every part of him was still intact. "You really gave it your all out there, huh?" Hizashi continued, his voice full of admiration. "I was on the edge of my seat the whole time." "You did great, Zuku." Izuku's smile faltered slightly. "But I didn't win." Hizashi shook his head, waving a hand dismissively. "It's not about winning, kid. It's about the effort you put in. You went up against Todoroki, one of the strongest guys out there, and you gave him a run for his money. That's what counts." Izuku's chest tightened. He appreciated Hizashi's words, but it didn't erase the disappointment gnawing at him. Aizawa, who had been standing quietly near the door, finally stepped forward, his dark eyes unreadable as he looked down at Izuku. "You pushed yourself too hard," Aizawa said flatly, his tone neutral, but not harsh. "But you didn't back down. You didn't give up." Izuku looked up at Aizawa, searching for any sign of disappointment in his teacher's expression, but all he found was that familiar, calm intensity. "You need to learn your limits," Aizawa continued, his voice steady. "But you've shown that you have the heart of a hero. That's what matters." Izuku's breath hitched, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Aizawa had always been a tough, no-nonsense mentor, and hearing those words from him, heart of a hero, meant more than he could express. Izuku's voice trembled slightly. "I wanted to help Todoroki. I wanted him to use his fire, to stop holding himself back, but..." "He did," Aizawa said, cutting him off. "After your fight, Todoroki started using his fire again. You got through to him." Izuku's eyes widened in surprise. "He did?" Aizawa nodded. "In his next match, he used both his ice and fire. It wasn't just about winning for him. You made him confront a part of himself he had been avoiding for a long time." Izuku's chest swelled with a mix of emotions, relief, pride, and even a small flicker of hope. He hadn't won the fight, but maybe he had made a difference. Maybe he had helped Todoroki in some way. "See?" Hizashi said, grinning. "You're making waves out there, Zuku. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're inspiring people." Izuku's heart ached with gratitude. Even though he had been consumed by his own doubts and insecurities, Hizashi and Aizawa were still there, reminding him of the bigger picture. They didn't see him as a failure, they saw him as someone who was learning, growing, and becoming stronger. The door to the infirmary slid open once more, and Recovery Girl glanced over as a new figure entered the room. It was Todoroki. Izuku's breath caught in his throat as Todoroki stepped inside, his usual calm expression softened by something like hesitation. He stood by the doorway for a moment, as if unsure of whether he should enter, but then he gave a small nod to Recovery Girl and approached Izuku's bed. "Izuku," Todoroki said quietly, his voice steady but with a hint of something unspoken. "I wanted to talk to you." Hizashi raised an eyebrow, glancing at Aizawa, before nudging him. "Let's give them some space, Shota?" Aizawa gave a small grunt of acknowledgement before turning to Izuku. "Rest up. You've got a lot ahead of you." With that, Aizawa and Hizashi exited the room, leaving Izuku alone with Todoroki. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, and Izuku wasn't sure where to begin. He shifted slightly in his bed, wincing at the pain that still lingered in his body. "Todoroki," Izuku started, but Todoroki shook his head. "You don't have to say anything," Todoroki said, his voice quiet. "I know what you were trying to do. And, you were right." Izuku blinked in surprise, his chest tightening. Todoroki's gaze dropped to the floor, his hands clenched at his sides. I've been holding myself back because of my father. I told myself I didn't want anything to do with his power, but that wasn't the whole truth. Izuku listened quietly, his heart aching as Todoroki's words filled the air. I've been running from myself, Todoroki continued, his voice barely above a whisper. And you made me see that. You made me realize that I can't keep rejecting a part of who I am. It's not just my father's power, it's my power too. Izuku's eyes widened, his throat tightening with emotion. He had never expected Todoroki to open up like this, and hearing it now, hearing the weight of Todoroki's inner conflict, was overwhelming. Todoroki, Izuku said softly, his voice full of sincerity. You're more than just your quirk. You're more than just your father's son. You're you. And you're strong, no matter what. Todoroki looked up at him, his eyes filled with something Izuku had never seen before, gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, Todoroki said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. But I'm going to try. I'm going to stop running from my fire. And it's because of you. Izuku felt a lump form in his throat, and he struggled to find the right words. He had never expected his fight with Todoroki to have such an impact, and now that it had, he didn't know what to say. I'm glad, Izuku finally said, his voice soft. I'm glad I could help. Todoroki nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It was a rare sight, but one that filled Izuku with warmth. The two sat in silence for a moment longer, the weight of their words hanging in the air. There was still so much left unsaid, so much that both of them were still grappling with, but for now, this was enough. They had both come out of that fight changed, and maybe that was the point. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about growth. After a few more moments, Todoroki stood, giving Izuku one last nod, before turning to leave. As the door slid shut behind him, Izuku let out a long, shaky breath, his heart full. The weight of defeat still lingered, but it didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. He had lost the fight, but he had gained something more important, something that couldn't be measured by victory or points. He had helped someone. And that, Izuku realized, was what being a hero was all about. Chapter 14, Bonds That Heal. Summary. Izuku reflects on the sports festival and the emotional toll it took on him. Aizawa and Hizashi reaffirm their support, reminding Izuku that he is part of their family now. This chapter focuses on the healing power of love and support as Izuku learns that it's okay to rely on others, and that he doesn't have to carry the weight of his struggles alone. Story. The afternoon sun was dipping low in the sky, casting a warm glow across the city as Izuku walked home from UA. His body still ached from the fight with Todoroki, but the pain was more manageable now. Recovery Girl had done what she could to heal him, but she had also warned him about pushing himself too hard in the future. Still, despite the lingering soreness, Izuku felt lighter. Something had shifted inside him after the sports festival, not just in terms of his physical abilities, but emotionally. He had lost the fight, but in a way, he had won something much bigger. His conversation with Todoroki in the infirmary had left a lasting impact on him, and for the first time in a long time, Izuku felt like he was starting to understand what being a hero was truly about. But as he approached the apartment where Aizawa and Hizashi were waiting, a different kind of nervousness crept into his chest. He had been living with them for months now, training under Aizawa's strict guidance and soaking in Hizashi's endless encouragement. But after the sports festival, after putting everything on the line, part of him worried that he had somehow let them down. That he wasn't living up to their expectations. Izuku shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. They had both been so supportive, especially after his fight with Todoroki. But the little voice inside his head, the one that had been with him for so many years, still whispered doubts. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, before stepping inside. The familiar warmth of the apartment greeted him, and the smell of something delicious wafted from the kitchen. Zuku. You're home. Hizashi's voice rang out from the kitchen, full of energy as always. He appeared in the doorway, a wide grin on his face. We were just about to start dinner. You hungry? I made your favorite, tempura. Izuku smiled, feeling a rush of warmth in his chest. Hizashi always knew how to make him feel at ease, even when his mind was swirling with doubts. Thanks, Hizashi. I'm starving. As Izuku stepped inside, he noticed Aizawa sitting at the table, his usual calm expression in place. Aizawa looked up briefly as Izuku entered, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement. Welcome back, Midoriya, Aizawa said, his tone neutral but familiar. Izuku couldn't help but smile at the quiet greeting. He had grown used to Aizawa's understated way of showing affection, and even a simple nod from him felt like a warm welcome home. As they sat down to dinner, the atmosphere in the apartment was comfortable, almost routine. Hizashi filled the room with his usual chatter, telling stories from his radio show and making jokes that had Izuku laughing between bites of tempura. Aizawa chimed in occasionally, his dry humor catching Izuku off guard in the best way. But despite the easygoing conversation, there was a tension in Izuku's chest that he couldn't shake. He hadn't talked about the sports festival with them in detail yet, not about how he felt like he'd failed or how much pressure he had put on himself. He knew they had watched the entire event, and he was terrified of what they might think. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and the laughter had faded into a comfortable silence, Izuku finally worked up the courage to speak. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Izuku said quietly, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. His heart thudded in his chest as the words left his mouth, but he forced himself to continue. I know I didn't win the festival. I know I made mistakes. And Whoa, wait a minute, Hizashi interrupted, leaning forward with a frown. What are you apologizing for, Zuku? You were amazing out there. Izuku blinked, taken aback by Hizashi's reaction. But I lost. I didn't win any of my matches, and I pushed myself too hard. I thought. You thought what? Aizawa's voice cut in, calm but firm. That you let us down? Izuku nodded slowly, his throat tight. Yeah. I mean, you've both been training me and helping me so much, and I couldn't even win a single match. I feel like Stop, Aizawa said, his voice commanding but not harsh. He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes focused on Izuku with an intensity that made Izuku's breath catch. You didn't let anyone down. Not me, not Hizashi, and certainly not yourself. Izuku stared at him, his heart pounding in his chest. But You pushed yourself to your limit, Aizawa continued, cutting him off again. You stood up to Todoroki, one of the strongest students in your class, and you didn't back down. You showed heart, Midoriya. You showed what it means to be a hero. Hizashi nodded enthusiastically, his grin returning. Exactly. You may not have won the whole thing, but you showed everyone who you are. That's more important than a trophy or a ranking. You're learning, you're growing, and you're already making a difference. Izuku felt his throat tighten, emotion swelling in his chest as their words sank in. He had been so focused on winning, so worried about proving himself, that he hadn't realized just how much he had already accomplished. But I pushed myself too far, Izuku said softly. I got hurt, and I made everyone worry. I know I need to be more careful. Aizawa's eyes softened slightly, and for a moment, the sternness in his expression faded. Yes, you do need to be more careful. You need to learn how to control your power without injuring yourself. But that doesn't mean you failed. It means you're still learning. And that's okay. Izuku blinked rapidly, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't realized were there. The tightness in his chest slowly loosened, replaced by a warmth that spread through him. Aizawa and Hizashi didn't see him as a failure. They didn't see his mistakes, they saw his effort, his growth. He had spent so long thinking that he had to be perfect, that he had to win every fight to be worthy of being at UA. But now, sitting here with them, he realized that being a hero wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the effort he put in, the lessons he learned, and the way he stood back up after falling down. "Thank you," Izuku whispered, his voice trembling. I really don't know what I'd do without you." Hizashi's grin widened, and he reached across the table to ruffle Izuku's hair affectionately. "You don't have to worry about that, Zuku. We're family. We've got your back, no matter what." Izuku's heart swelled at the word, family. He hadn't realized just how much he had longed to hear that until now. Aizawa and Hizashi weren't just his mentors. They weren't just pro-heroes he admired from afar. They were his family. They had taken him in, supported him, and believed in him when he had doubted himself. Aizawa stood up from the table, his eyes still on Izuku. "You've come a long way, Midoriya. But you've got a long road ahead of you. Don't forget that." Izuku nodded, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I won't." Hizashi leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms behind his head with a satisfied grin. "We're proud of you, Zuku. You've got the heart of a hero, and that's what really matters. Now, get some rest. You've earned it." As Izuku made his way to his room, his heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. The anxiety, the pressure, the doubts, they were still there, but they didn't feel as heavy anymore. He wasn't alone in carrying them. He had a family now, and they were with him every step of the way. Lying in bed that night, Izuku stared up at the ceiling, his mind drifting back to the sports festival, to Todoroki, and to everything he had learned. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be more challenges, more failures, more pain. But now, he also knew that he didn't have to face it alone. A small smile tugged at his lips as he closed his eyes, the warmth of Aizawa's and Hizashi's words still echoing in his mind. "I'm not alone. I have them. I have a family." And with that thought, for the first time in a long time, Izuku drifted off to sleep with a sense of peace. Chapter 15, Home is where the heart is. Summary. In the final chapter, Izuku fully embraces his place in the family. He expresses his gratitude to Aizawa and Hizashi, realizing that he has found something he never thought he would, a home. The chapter ends on a hopeful note, with Izuku ready to face the future, knowing he has the love and support of the people who believe in him most. Story. The soft hum of the apartment felt comforting as Izuku woke up to the faint light of morning streaming through his window. He stretched slowly, his body still sore from the sports festival, but the ache had become familiar. It was a reminder that he was growing stronger, learning, and becoming the hero he wanted to be. For the first time in what felt like forever, Izuku woke up feeling at peace. The warmth of the apartment, his home now, wrapped around him like a blanket, and as he lay there, he let his thoughts drift to the past few months. So much had changed. He had gone from being a lonely boy with a quirkless past to someone who had not only been accepted into UA but had also found a family in the most unexpected of places. Aizawa and Hizashi weren't like any family he had imagined. Aizawa's quiet, steady presence balanced Hizashi's boundless energy, and together, they had created a space where Izuku felt safe, where he felt like he belonged. And after years of feeling like he was an outsider, that sense of belonging meant everything. But as much as Izuku had found peace in their home, there was a part of him that still struggled with the idea that it was real. That these two pro-heroes had taken him in, cared for him, and treated him as if he were their own. He was still adjusting to what that meant, and some mornings, like today, he had to remind himself that this was no longer a dream. It was real. With that thought in mind, Izuku slowly climbed out of bed and got dressed. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint sounds of breakfast being prepared in the kitchen. Hizashi was humming to himself, and the scent of coffee filled the air, making Izuku's stomach rumble. When he stepped into the kitchen, Hizashi greeted him with his usual bright grin. "Morning, Zuku. Sleep well?" Izuku smiled, his heart warming at the sound of the nickname Hizashi had started using for him. Yeah, I did. Thanks. Aizawa was seated at the table, sipping his coffee as he read through a stack of papers. He looked up briefly when Izuku entered, giving him a nod of acknowledgement. You've got the weekend off, Midoriya. Take it easy today. Izuku nodded, sitting down at the table and glancing around the apartment. It was small, modest, but to him, it felt like home in a way nothing else ever had. The walls were lined with shelves of books, a mix of Aizawa's academic texts and Hizashi's more eclectic collection of music and comics. The kitchen was cluttered with various mugs and gadgets Hizashi had collected over the years, while the living room was filled with comfortable, worn furniture that made the space feel lived in. Hey, I've been meaning to ask, Hizashi said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Now that the festival's over, how are you feeling? Physically, I mean. Izuku hesitated for a moment, then gave a small smile. I'm still sore, but it's getting better. Recovery girl did a good job patching me up. Aizawa's gaze flicked toward him, sharp but not harsh. And mentally? How are you holding up after the fight? Izuku paused, caught off guard by the direct question. He hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but now that Aizawa had asked, he realized there was more to unpack than just physical recovery. The fight with Todoroki, the emotional toll of the sports festival, the weight of his own self-doubt, it was all still there, simmering under the surface. But something had changed. I think, Izuku began, his voice thoughtful. I think I'm doing better. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a hero, and I know I have a long way to go. But I'm not as afraid as I used to be. I know I can keep getting stronger. I just have to keep moving forward. Hizashi beamed, clapping a hand on Izuku's shoulder. That's the spirit, kiddo. You've already come so far, and trust me, you're only gonna go further from here. Aizawa didn't say anything for a moment, but his eyes softened slightly as he studied Izuku. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but filled with a weight that made Izuku sit up straighter. You've changed a lot since you came to live with us, Midoriya, Aizawa said quietly. You're stronger, more focused. But more than that, you've learned how to trust yourself. That's the most important part. Izuku felt his chest tighten at Aizawa's words. He had always admired Aizawa's strength, his wisdom, and the way he never let anything, or anyone, shake his calm demeanor. But hearing Aizawa recognize that growth in him, it meant more than he could express. Thanks, Aizawa-sensei, Izuku said softly, his voice full of sincerity. Aizawa gave a small nod, his eyes lingering on Izuku for a moment longer before returning to his papers. As they ate breakfast together, the familiar comfort of the morning routine settled over them. Hizashi continued to chatter away, telling Izuku about the latest updates from his radio show, while Aizawa listened quietly, occasionally offering a dry comment that made Hizashi laugh. But as the morning wore on, a thought kept tugging at the edge of Izuku's mind, one that had been there for a while, but he hadn't been able to put into words. Now, though, sitting here with them, it felt like the right time. Izuku hesitated, glancing between Aizawa and Hizashi. I've been thinking about something. Both men turned to him, their attention fully focused, and Izuku's heart began to race. This was something he had been carrying with him for a while, but he didn't know how to say it without sounding foolish or ungrateful. Hizashi tilted his head, his expression curious. What's up, Izuku? Something on your mind? Izuku took a deep breath, gathering his courage. I wanted to say thank you. For everything. You didn't have to take me in, but you did. And you've both been, more than I ever could have hoped for. He paused, his throat tightening as the words stuck in his chest. I've never really had a family like this before. But now, with you two, I feel like I finally do. And I just wanted you to know how much that means to me. The room fell into a heavy silence as Izuku's words hung in the air. He stared down at his hands, afraid to meet their eyes, afraid of what they might say. But before he could spiral any further, Hizashi reached across the table and took Izuku's hand in his grip firm but warm. "You're family to us too, Zuku," Hizashi said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "We didn't take you in because we felt like we had to. We took you in because we wanted to. You're one of us now. You're home." Izuku's breath caught in his throat, and he blinked rapidly to keep the tears from spilling over. He had known, deep down, that this was true, but hearing it said aloud, hearing Hizashi call him family, made his heart swell with an overwhelming sense of love and belonging. Aizawa, who had been silent, leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes focused intently on Izuku. "You're not a burden, Midoriya. And you never will be. This is your home as much as it is ours. You're part of this family." Izuku couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They spilled over, streaming down his cheeks as he choked out a soft, trembling laugh. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Hizashi leaned over and pulled Izuku into a tight hug, his arms wrapped securely around him. "Anytime, kiddo. We're proud of you. And we always will be." Aizawa remained seated, his expression calm but his eyes warm as he watched the two of them. He wasn't one for big displays of affection, but his presence was just as comforting, just as reassuring. As the morning stretched on, the three of them settled back into the comfortable rhythm of their home. It wasn't perfect, and there would still be challenges ahead, Izuku knew that better than anyone. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he wasn't facing those challenges alone. He had a family now. He had a home. And with Aizawa and Hizashi by his side, Izuku knew he could face anything the world threw at him. Thank you angels for listening to The Green Pup in a Den of Heroes. If you have suggestions, let me know. Don't forget to subscribe to know when the next one is out. Have a good day angels.